The iron-rimmed wheels of the overland stage screamed their final protest against the rock, grinding to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust that tasted like pulverized bone. It was high summer in the year 1886, and Sagebrush Vale, Copper Mesa County, felt less like a town and more like the inside of a blacksmith's forge. A brutal, white-hot sun hammered down from a sky the color of bleached linen. The wind, when it bothered to move, did not cool. It simply pushed the heat around, carrying the sulphurous smell of the distant hot springs and the sharp tang of horse sweat. From the suffocating interior of the coach, Eliza Hartwell emerged last, her movements stiff. She felt the eyes of the town upon her before she even saw them, a handful of dusty men lounging in the thin strips of shade offered by the boardwalk's overhang. A woman pausing with a basket on her hip, all staring. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on her own 2 feet as they found the solid, scorching earth. She clutched her single canvas valise so tightly her knuckles were white. It was all she had. Inside, there were 3 worn dresses, a small, cracked daguerreotype of a mother she barely remembered, a heavy ledger bound in faded purple cloth, and the letter, crisp and formal, was her contract. The entire reason for this desperate 1,000-mile journey into desolation. It was a promise of marriage, brokered by an agency back east, to a man she had never seen, a Mr. Rowan Cade. The dust settled on the shoulders of her gray traveling suit, instantly turning the fabric gritty. Her throat was a dry knot of fear. A shape detached itself from the deep shadows of the post office veranda. He was tall, as the letter had promised, with shoulders wide enough to block the sun. He moved with an unsettling economy of motion, not a wasted step, his boots making almost no sound in the thick dust. He wore a blue chambray shirt, sun-faded to the color of the sky, and denim trousers tucked into worn leather boots. A scar, a thin white line, cut a path from his left temple down across his cheekbone, pulling the skin tight. It was an old wound, but it gave his face a permanent, unsettling tension. He stopped a good 10 feet away, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, taking her in from beneath the brim of a stained felt hat. He wasn't smiling, not really. It was a slight lift at one corner of his mouth, more a grimace than a welcome. When he spoke, his voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come more from his chest than his throat, laced with the dry rasp of the high desert. "Darlin," he said, the word slow and heavy. "I don't bite." A terrible, suffocating pause hung in the air, thick as the heat. Eliza's heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, seemed to stop entirely. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted a fraction more. "Unless," Eliza took an involuntary step back, her heel hitting the iron stage wheel. The movement was pure, animal instinct. Her free hand flew to her throat, her fingers brushing the smooth, deadly point of the hatpin that held her straw bonnet in place. It was a 4-inch steel spike, her last and only defense. Her knuckles whitened around it. The man's eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face. The faint mockery vanished, replaced by something unreadable. He slowly, deliberately, raised both his hands, palms open and empty, holding them shoulder high for her to see. "Bad joke," he said, and the rasp was gone. His voice suddenly quieter, calmer. "My apologies, ma'am. The heat makes a man foolish. I'm Rowan Cade." Eliza said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat was locked. The pulse was back. A frantic drumbeat she could feel in her ears, in her very palms. From the boardwalk, the whispers started, just loud enough to carry, sharp as thorns. "That's him. That's Cade. The one who shot down the Prentice brothers. All 3 of them. Right in the street. Heard the first one. His wife just ran, took off in the middle of a rainstorm and never looked back. Look at her. She's terrified. Poor thing." The whispers pricked at Eliza's composure. But the man, Rowan Cade, seemed not to hear them, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He held his empty-handed pose for another second, a gesture of absolute, deliberate non-aggression. Then, slowly, he lowered his arms. He gave a curt nod to the stage driver, who was already tossing luggage from the roof. "This one mine?" he asked, pointing not at Eliza, but at the valise she still held in a death grip. Eliza could only nod, a jerky, bird-like motion. Rowan stepped forward, but not toward her. He moved to the spot where the driver had thrown her bag. He bent, and with 2 hands, he lifted the canvas valise. He handled it not as if it were heavy, but as if it were fragile, like a crate of eggs or fine glass. He held it in one hand, his arm extended, then looked back at her. He didn't speak again. He just waited. He was giving her the choice to follow. The stage driver, eager to be rid of his passenger and this silent tension, tipped his hat. "Good luck, ma'am." He climbed back onto his box, cracked his whip, and with another groan of iron, the stagecoach lurched away, leaving Eliza alone in the street with her shadow and her future. Rowan Cade turned and began to walk. Eliza's feet felt like lead, but to remain standing in the middle of the street was impossible. She took a breath, the hot dust stinging her lungs, and followed him. He led the way to a gray horse, a sturdy-looking animal with intelligent eyes, tied to a hitching rail. The horse, Ash, tossed its head and blew softly as Rowan approached. He tied her valise behind the saddle with practiced, efficient movements, his hands strong and sure on the leather straps. He didn't offer to help her mount. He didn't offer her the horse at all. He merely untied the reins and looked at her. "It's a ways, about 2 miles. He started walking, leading the horse, leaving her to walk beside him. The walk was a silent ordeal. The town of Sagebrush Vale, with its peeling false fronts and staring windows, gave way to the open, cracked earth of the high desert. The land was brittle, covered in silvery green sagebrush and skeletal greasewood. The sun beat down, and the path they followed was little more than 2 ruts in the parched ground, which had cracked into a pattern like the scales of some enormous, dead fish. Eliza walked with her head down, watching the hem of her dress kick up small puffs of pale dust with every step. Her city-made boots, thin-soled and foolish, were already beginning to pinch, and a blister was forming on her heel. But as she walked, a part of her mind, the part that wrote in the purple ledger, was observing, calculating, recording. "He keeps to my pace. He hasn't asked me to hurry. He walks on the side of the path closer to the sun, leaving me the sliver of shade cast by the horse. He hasn't asked a single question. Not my name, not about my journey, not one word. And he has not, under any circumstance, tried to touch me." This last observation settled deepest. The men she had known back east. In the crowded, dirty city she'd fled, they were all hands, grabbing, pushing, demanding. This man's stillness, his deliberate distance, was as strange and foreign as the landscape itself. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds, the soft plod of Ash's hooves, the crunch of their own boots, and the high, thin cry of a hawk circling in the metallic sky. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the western hills in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The air grew no cooler, but the light changed, the shadows stretching long and black across the path. Finally, they crossed a rickety wooden bridge over a dry creek bed. The hollow thump-thump-thump of the horse's hooves on the planks sounded like a warning. And then she saw it. The Painted Arrow Ranch. It was not a grand estate. It was a simple, 1-story log house, its wood silvered by time and sun. Beside it stood an L-shaped barn, sturdy and practical, and beyond that, a tall, round water tank made of corrugated tin, its surface glinting like a dull silver coin in the fading light. The only sentinel was a single, ancient cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling with a dry, papery sound, offering the only real shade for miles. Rowan led the horse to the barn, speaking a low word to the animal. He didn't invite Eliza into the house. He simply left her standing by the porch steps, went into the barn, and returned a moment later without her valise. He mounted the porch steps and pushed open the front door, holding it for her. The inside was dark and cooler by at least 10 degrees. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. It was clean, sparsely furnished, but clean. He walked past a main room, a table, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, and down a short hall. He stopped at a door and pushed it open. The room was small, containing only a narrow iron bedstead, a wooden chest, and a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl. But the window looked out onto the vast, empty plains, and the bed was covered with a brightly colored, neatly patched quilt. Her valise was already sitting on the floor by the chest. Rowan Cade stood in the doorway, his large frame filling it, silhouetted against the dim light of the hall. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a small, brass key. He didn't step into the room, but held it out to her. Eliza looked at the key, then at his face. The scar was lost in the shadow. "The door has a new lock," he said, his voice flat, a statement of fact. "There's a bolt on the inside, as well." She hesitated, then stepped forward and took the key from his calloused palm. His skin was hot and dry. It was the first time they had touched. He drew his hand back. "This house is safe." "Ma'am," he said. He looked past her, at the window, at the darkening sky. "You have my word on that. You don't owe me a thing tonight." He paused, and his gray eyes met hers, holding them steady. "Or ever." With that, he turned and walked away. She heard his bootsteps fade down the hall, the sound of the front door opening, and then closing with a quiet, solid thud. Eliza stood frozen in the center of the small room, the brass key growing warm in her hand. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic squeak groan of the windmill pumping water into the tank. Slowly, she reached out and closed the door. She turned the key. The click of the lock tumbling into place was deafeningly loud. Her fingers found the iron bolt. It was heavy, new, and well-oiled. She slid it home. Shk. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It came out as a ragged, trembling sigh. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she leaned her back against the solid wood of the door, pressing her palms flat against the planks. She listened. Only the wind. Only the windmill. Her heart, which had been a trapped bird in her throat for hours, for weeks, finally began to slow. It descended from her throat, settled back into her chest, and found a steadier, heavier rhythm. She closed her eyes, the grit on her eyelids scratching. She was thousands of miles from everything she'd ever known. She was bound by contract to a scarred man with a shadowed past. She was in a barren land that seemed designed to kill. But for the first time in more than a year, as she stood alone in a locked room, she had the undeniable, soaring, and utterly foreign feeling that she was no longer prey. She woke not to the clatter of iron wheels and shouting vendors she had known her entire life, but to the slow, metallic groan of the windmill and the sharp, bright call of a meadowlark. The air in her small room was cool, a relief from the oppressive memory of yesterday's heat. She had slept, truly slept, behind the locked door and the heavy iron bolt. It was the first time in over a year she hadn't woken in a cold sweat, a smell, rich and potent, cut through the dry air. Coffee, not the weak, boiled chicory she was used to, but the deep, smoky aroma of real grounds, roasted dark. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons. When she eased the bolt back, a sound that felt loud in the stillness, and opened the door. She found a tin mug sitting on the floor, right on the threshold. Steam rose from it in a thin, steady line. Eliza picked it up. It was hot, almost too hot to hold. She stepped into the main room. It was empty. Through the open front door, she saw him, his back to her, already halfway to the barn, his stride long and purposeful. He hadn't waited for thanks. He hadn't waited for conversation. He had provided, and he had retreated, giving her the dignity of her own mourning. She took a sip. It was strong, almost bitter, but it was the most welcome thing she had ever tasted. She stepped out onto the porch, clutching the mug, and observed her new world in the clear, unforgiving light of morning. The Painted Arrow Ranch, she realized, was a place of deliberate order. It wasn't tidy, not in the way a city parlor was tidy, but it was kept. Along the porch rail, a row of saddle blankets was draped to catch the sun, aired out to prevent sores. On pegs by the barn door, bridles and reins hung in neat loops, the leather dark and supple. clearly having been oiled just days before. A stack of new split cedar posts for mending fences was piled neatly, and the splitting maul beside it wasn't rusted. Its wooden handle was worn smooth, shaped by the grip of a single, consistent hand. This was not the property of a reckless man. Whatever violence the town whispered about, this place spoke of diligence. This, her Eastern mind processed, was a man who understood assets and liabilities, a man who maintained his property. The realization settled something deep inside her. He emerged from the barn, leading the gray horse, Ash already saddled. He saw her watching, and for a moment they just stood, separated by 30 yards of dusty ground. He gave a single, curt nod, not of greeting, but of acknowledgement. He was working near the corral, mending a leather strap, when she approached, mug empty. She intended to just set it down and return to the house, but she found herself pausing, watching a length of rope coiled by the fence. "You'll need to know the knot," he said, not looking up from his work. Eliza startled. It was the first thing he'd said to her all day. "What knot?" He finished his task, then picked up the rope, the bowline. It's the one that holds. It won't slip, and it won't jam, even when it's wet or pulled tight. He held the rope and began to move his large, calloused hands in a slow, precise pattern. "The rabbit comes out of the hole," he murmured, forming a loop. "Goes around the tree." He looped the end around the standing line and goes back in the hole. He pulled it tight, and a perfect, secure loop formed. He held it out for her to inspect. Then he shook it loose with a snap of his wrist and offered her the rope. "Your turn." Eliza took it. The rope was stiff, abrasive against her soft palms. She tried to mimic his movements. "The rabbit out of the hole!" Her attempt collapsed into a tangle. She flushed, frustrated, feeling clumsy and useless. She expected impatience. A sigh. A sharp correction. Rowan Cade merely leaned against the corral fence and waited. His eyes, she noticed, weren't on her face, judging her failure. They were fixed on the rope in her hands, giving her the space to think, to breathe, to fail without an audience. She took a breath and started again. Out of the hole, around the tree. Her fingers moved, this time finding the logic in the weave. "Back in." She pulled. The knot held. A small, strange flicker of pride warmed her. She looked up at him. "Again," he said, his voice flat. She did, and again. By the 5th time, her hands knew the motion. "That'll hold a calf," he said, "or a bucket in a well, or a man, if it comes to it." He took the rope, coiled it in 3 quick motions, and hung it on its peg. The lesson was over. Later that week, they had to ride into Sagebrush Vale for supplies. The silence in the buckboard was thick, filled only by the clop of the horses and the squeak of the wagon springs. The town was just as she remembered, dusty and quiet. The stairs just as sharp. Rowan pulled up outside the general store. "I need grain and salt. Be about 20 minutes. It wasn't a question. It was a schedule. "I need thread," Eliza said, gathering her small purse. He paused, glancing at the shop across the street. "Sylvie's," he pointed with his chin. "She's fair." Eliza crossed the street, the bell above the fabric shop door tinkling brightly. The shop was an oasis of color and order. Bolts of calico and flannel stacked to the ceiling. A woman with sharp gray eyes and hair pulled into a tight bun looked up from a ledger. "Ma'am," the woman said. Her voice was neutral, her face unreadable. This was Sylvie March, the town's matriarch of dry goods. Eliza felt the assessment. She was being weighed, measured as the cowboy's mail-order curiosity. "I need a spool of black cotton thread, number 50 and 2 yards of plain linen, if you have it," Eliza said, her voice clear, her gaze steady. Sylvie March held the look for a beat longer, then seemed to find what she was looking for. She turned, pulled the thread from a drawer, and measured the linen. Her movements efficient. "That'll be 40 cents, she said, as Eliza counted the coins. Sylvie leaned forward. "Just slightly. Heard you calm the new filly. Quiver. That one's got a mean streak." Eliza looked up, surprised. She was just frightened. Sylvie March almost smiled. She wrapped the goods in brown paper. As she handed the package over, she gave Eliza a small, tight nod. It was almost invisible, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't friendship. It was a seedling of respect, a gesture that said, "You might just survive this." While Rowan loaded the heavy sacks of grain, Eliza stood on the boardwalk. She heard the low murmur of men inside the Silver Kettle Saloon, the door propped open for air. Crow's buying up all the claims on the North Range. Heard he's aiming for Cade's water. That tank lease is up come September, ain't it? That's the rumor. Silas Crow wants the rights to Willow Draw. And that tank's fed by it. If he gets it, he strangles the Painted Arrow by Thanksgiving. Cade will have to sell for pennies. Eliza's blood ran cold. Despite the 100-degree heat, Silas Crow, Willow Draw, lease expiring. She turned away, her face a mask of calm, and climbed back onto the buckboard. That night, after Rowan had disappeared into the barn, Eliza pulled the purple-bound ledger from her valise. It was not a diary of feelings. It was a logbook, a habit born of a life in the East where verbal contracts were broken and creditors were wolves. She had learned that survival depended on documentation. She lit her small lamp, dipped her pen, and wrote August 10th, 1886. Town Talk Silas Crow, owner of adjacent ranch Crow stock feed, intends to secure water rights to Painted Arrow main tank, fed by Willow Draw. Current lease allegedly expires September. Witnesses unidentified men at Silver Kettle Saloon. Noted. She blotted the page. The meticulous script a stark contrast to the rough-hewn walls of the room. She was mapping the threats. Dinner was beans simmered with salt pork and a pan of skillet-hot cornbread. They ate at the small kitchen table. The silence, which had been so tense on the first day, had settled. It was no longer an awkward, empty void. It was a shared space. It was the quiet of two people who were tired from a long day's work. It was, Eliza thought, anchoring. It was a silence that kept the storms of the outside world at bay. After, they sat on the porch as the sky turned a deep, bruised violet. The wind smelled of dust and distant pine. Eliza rocked quietly in the chair, her hands folded in her lap. Rowan took a small block of ironwood from his pocket, and his knife, with slow, practiced strokes. He began to whittle. The blade made a soft, rhythmic sh-sh-sh against the hard wood. Eliza watched him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't just carving. He was methodical. His brow furrowed slightly. His attention focused entirely on the small object taking shape. It was a ring, a simple wooden band. She had seen him work on it before, always at night, always when the air was tense. It was, she realized, what he did when he was worried. He was worried about Silas Crow. He was worried about the water. Eliza turned her gaze to the horizon, pretending not to see. She didn't ask what he was making. She didn't ask if he was all right. To do so would be to breach the wall he had so carefully built. Instead, she just sat, her presence a silent testament. I am here. I am not running. In the barn, the new filly, Quiver, was still skittish. A few days later, Eliza was bringing a bucket of water when a tumbleweed blew hard against the barn door. A sudden, rattling crash. Quiver exploded. The horse reared, eyes white, crashing against the stall door. Eliza's first instinct was to drop the bucket and run. Her heart leaped into her throat. The old panic, the smell of smoke and fear, rising fast. But she didn't run. She set the bucket down. Slowly. Easy, she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Easy, girl. It's just the wind. She didn't move toward the horse. She just stood, made her body small, and forced herself to breathe. In for 4, out for 4. The same steadying rhythm she used when the ledgers wouldn't balance and the creditors were at the door. You are safe, she whispered, as much to herself as to the horse. It's just noise. Quiver snorted, her body trembling, but her front hooves stayed on the ground. Her ears swiveled, flicked toward Eliza's voice. The panic in her eyes began to recede, replaced by wary curiosity. Eliza held out her hand, palm down, and kept breathing. She didn't know how long she stood there until she sensed him. Rowan was leaning against the main barn door, arms crossed, watching. He hadn't made a sound. He watched her for a long moment. He looked at the horse, now nosing Eliza's outstretched hand. Then he looked at Eliza. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a quick, sharp glint of something. Acknowledgement. He pushed off the doorframe and walked away, not saying a word. That night, as Eliza prepared for bed, she slid the bolt and paused. A slice of yellow light shone under her door. He had left the main kitchen lamp burning. The wick turned low. She opened her door a crack. The lamp cast a small, steady pool of light in the hall, chasing away the deepest shadows, ensuring she wouldn't wake in pitch blackness. She slipped her purple ledger under her pillow, a new entry in her mind. He leaves the lamp lit until I'm asleep. She was just drifting off, suspended in the comfortable quiet, when she heard it, the soft thud of a horse's hoof on the packed earth near the fence line. It was moving slowly, cautiously. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering. She heard the sound of Rowan's boots in the main room, then the front door creaking open. Eliza slipped from her bed and crept to her window. The moon was a thin sliver, but the stars were bright. She saw a shape, a man on horseback, stop at the gatepost of the Painted Arrow. The rider leaned down, affixed something white to the post, then spurred his horse and disappeared into the darkness. She watched Rowan walk, not run, to the gate. He didn't look back at the house. He pulled the paper from the post, his movements economical, unhurried. He walked back inside, closing the door softly. Eliza, her nightgown clutched at her throat, opened her door. He was standing by the kitchen table, in the small circle of light from the lamp he had left for her. He unfolded the paper. She could see the crude, dark letters from where she stood. Leave Willow Draw or lose it all. At the bottom, 2 stark initials, S.C. Rowan Cade stood perfectly still. He didn't curse. His face didn't change. But Eliza saw his shoulders tighten, his free hand clench into a fist at his side. Then, deliberately, he crumpled the note. He lifted the glass globe of the lamp. The flame flickered. He touched the edge of the paper to the wick. It caught instantly, flaring bright orange, illuminating his face, the scar, the hard line of his jaw. He held it until the flames licked his fingers, then dropped the black, curling ash into the cold metal sink. He replaced the globe. The kitchen was quiet again. He looked up, and his gray eyes met hers down the dark hallway. He knew she had seen. He offered no explanation, no comfort. Tomorrow, he said, his voice a low, cold rumble. We checked the water valve. The main valve was a mile from the house, tucked into a rocky cleft where the Willow Draw narrowed. It was a place of deep shadows and damp earth, the air carrying the faint, sour tang of sulfur from the hot springs further up the canyon. Rowan led the way, his movements silent, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Eliza followed, her purple ledger tucked into her waistband, a pencil in her pocket. They found it immediately, a heavy, new-looking brass padlock, gleaming yellow against the rust-flecked iron of the valve wheel. "That's not mine," Rowan said. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. Eliza knelt. The ground around the valve was soft, muddy from the slow seep of the spring. In the mud were 2 sets of deep, clear boot prints. They were crude, with no discernible heel pattern, the kind of cheap, mass-produced boots a hired hand might wear. And they pointed in only one direction east, toward the vast, open range that bordered Silas Crow's property. Rowan hunkered down beside her, his gaze fixed on the tracks. He touched the edge of one print, his fingers tracing its outline. He said nothing, but the muscles in his jaw nodded. A breeze, trapped in the canyon, swirled around them. It carried a different scent, not just the sulfur, but a smell of old, wet char. It was the faint, unmistakable odor of a long-dead campfire, soaked by the seep, now drying in the morning sun. For Eliza, the smell was a key. It unlocked a door in her mind, a door she kept bolted, barred, and sealed. The smell of soot, the crackle not of a campfire, but of beams, the heat, the screaming. It wasn't the sound of a market, but the sound of panic, of people trapped, She was holding a hand, a smaller, sweat-slicked hand, her sister, Lily. The smoke was thick, black, smelling of burning wool and chemicals from the dye vats in the warehouse next door. It wasn't air. It was a heavy, hot blanket. She couldn't breathe. Her eyes were streaming. "Eliza, I can't." The small hand was ripped from hers. A surge of fleeing men, their faces black with soot, pushed her, carried her. "Eliza." Rowan's voice cut through the memory. But it was distant. She was still there, in the alley, the flames roaring from the windows, the smoke a solid, choking wall. She was trembling. Her hand, the one that had held Lily's, was shaking so violently she had to clench it into a fist. She realized she wasn't breathing. She gasped, but the air she pulled in tasted of ash. "It's just smoke," she whispered, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar sound. "It's just smoke." Rowan moved. He didn't reach for her. He didn't touch her shoulder or try to offer a comforting word. He simply shifted his tall frame, planting his feet, and stood between her and the wind, blocking the breeze that carried the scent. He stood like a wall, a solid, living barrier. He waited a beat. Then he pulled a clean, folded handkerchief from his back pocket. He didn't offer it. He pressed it into her clenched fist. "It's just an old fire pit," he said, his voice low and steady, an anchor in the storm of her memory. "Nothing's burning now." He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask why she was pale, why she was shaking. He just stood there, his back to the wind, his rifle held down, his presence an absolute, unspoken promise of safety. Eliza pressed the cloth to her face. It smelled of soap and sun. She breathed it in, forcing the scent of ash from her lungs. She focused on the weave of the fabric, on the solid shape of the man in front of her. The roaring in her ears subsided. The shaking in her hand lessened. She folded the handkerchief and held it. "The lock," she said, her voice still rough. But it was her voice. "Can you break it, not without drawing attention?" "He wants me to," Rowan said, his eyes scanning the rocks above them. "He wants a fight. Here, not a legal one." "Then we don't give him one," Eliza said. She stood up, her legs steadier. "We give him the legal one." Sheriff Burke Holliday's office in Sagebrush Vale was hot, cramped, and smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. Holliday was a large man, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, his mustache stained with tobacco. He was shuffling a stack of wanted posters when they entered. And he didn't look up. "Mr. Cade, ma'am," he grunted. "Someone's put a new lock on my main water valve." "Sheriff," Rowan said. His voice clipped. "The tracks lead straight toward Crow's Land." Holliday sighed. A long, put-upon sound. He finally looked up, his eyes a watery, indifferent blue. "Now, Rowan, you know I can't do anything about that. Tracks in the dust. That ain't proof. That's just tracks. Could be anyone. Maybe you lost your key and forgot. It's a new lock. Burke, not mine." "Still," the sheriff said, spreading his hands. "What do you want me to do? Go arrest Silas Crow because you found a padlock. I got no jurisdiction over a civil dispute. You got a problem with a lease. You take it to the land office or the council." He glanced, just for a second, out the window, across the street. One of Crow's men, a lanky fellow named Tobin Vale, was leaning against a post, ostensibly asleep, but his hat was tipped just enough to watch the sheriff's door. "He's right," Eliza said quietly. Rowan turned to look at her, surprised by her sudden agreement. "Ma'am, Sheriff," Holliday asked, raising an eyebrow. "You have no jurisdiction over a civil matter, but the town archives their public record, correct, under your protection?" "Well, sure, down in the clerk's office, but thank you for your time. Sheriff." Eliza turned and walked out. Rowan, after a moment's hesitation, followed her, a look of profound confusion on his face. The clerk's office was in the cellar of the town hall. It was cool and blessedly quiet, the air thick with the dry, sweet smell of decaying paper and leather bindings. A small, bespectacled clerk barely looked up as Eliza set to work. This was her world. Not dust and horses, but ink and ledgers. "What are we looking for?" Rowan asked, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. He looked out of place, his large frame and rifle seeming to shrink the room. Copper Mesa Council meeting minutes and water permits. 1878, 1879, around there, for an hour. She pulled heavy, dust-covered books. Rowan stood by the door, his presence keeping the clerk from becoming too curious. Eliza's fingers, stained with old ink, flew across the pages, and then she found it. Water tank permit, number 47, granted to Painted Arrow Ranch. Date April 3rd, 1879. Notarized by Maeve Alton, public notary. Her eyes scanned the dense, spidery script, her pulse quickening. Rowan watched her, saw her back go rigid, and there it was. At the bottom, a single, cramped sentence. License to remain in effect, with automatic renewal in perpetuity, provided the owner maintains active cultivation and homesteading on the aforementioned property. He lied, Eliza whispered, her finger tracing the words. It's not expiring. It never expires. As long as you're working the land, Crow's entire claim is based on a lie. Rowan stepped closer, leaning over her shoulder to read the text. She could feel the heat radiating from him. He thinks we don't know this. He's counting on the original being lost. Which is why, Eliza said, turning to the clerk. I'll need a certified and notarized copy of this page immediately. The clerk, grumbling, did as he was told. He stamped the copy with the town seal, and Eliza herself paid the 2-bit fee. She folded the document, her hands steady, and sealed it in an envelope. When they stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, Rowan looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the barn, after she had calmed the filly, but magnified. It was a look of raw, unfiltered reassessment. He was seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a mail-order bride, not as a frightened woman from the East, but as a fighter, a different kind, one who used ink and seals instead of iron and lead. He saw, in that moment, a strategic ally. That night, the ranch was too quiet. The confrontation at the valve, the victory in the archives, had stretched the tension taut. Rowan sat on the porch, whittling his block of ironwood, the sh-sh-sh of the blade, the only sound. Eliza sat inside, at the kitchen table, her purple ledger open, making notes. She was just about to close the book and retire to her room when the sound came, a sharp whistle, followed by the catastrophic crash of glass. Eliza cried out, more from shock than pain. As her window exploded inward, a spray of broken glass peppered her room. A large, jagged rock thudded onto the wooden floor. She felt a sharp, stinging pain on her left wrist. Before the last shard of glass had even settled, her locked door burst open. The wood of the jamb splintered as Rowan hit it with his shoulder, a revolver in his hand, his face a mask of primal fury. He swept the room in a single glance. The broken window, the rock, Eliza, standing by the bed, her hand pressed to her wrist, where a thin line of red was welling up. The gun vanished. He was at her side in 2 strides. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice rough. "No, just a scratch. The glass." He gently took her wrist, his thumbs swiping away the blood. It was a shallow, 2-inch cut. "Sit," he commanded. He strode into the kitchen, returned with the bandages she had seen him use on the horse, and a bottle of whiskey. He poured a bit of the liquor onto the cloth, and she hissed as he cleaned the wound. His hands were impossibly gentle, his touch firm but careful as he wrapped the white bandage. They stood in the ruined, moonlit room, the night air, suddenly cold, pouring through the broken window. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "For what you didn't throw the rock. For the joke," he said, his eyes fixed on the bandage. "The first day. I don't bite. It was a stupid, cruel thing to say to someone in your position." Eliza looked at their joined hands, his large, brown, and calloused, wrapped around her smaller, paler one. "No, it wasn't," she said softly. He looked up, confused. "It was the first true thing I learned about you." "What?" "That joke," she said, meeting his gaze, her own clear and steady. "It told me that you understood fear, and that you knew when to stop, even when you didn't have to." A half-smile touched her lips. "It's why I wasn't afraid to drink the coffee you left me." A complex, unreadable emotion passed over his face. He held her gaze for a long time, the silence stretching, filled with the sound of the wind rattling the broken glass. A noise from the barn, a horse shifting uneasily. A muffled thump broke the spell. Rowan was instantly alert. "Stay here, bolt what's left of the door." He was gone. Eliza waited, her heart hammering. For 10 minutes that felt like 10 years. Finally, she heard him at the front door. She unbolted her own and met him in the kitchen. What was it? "They're getting bold," he said. He was angry, but it was a cold, controlled burn. "They didn't try to harm the stock. It was a theft. 3 sacks of oats are gone. 3 sacks, enough to be an insult. Enough to show they can come and go as they please." He pointed to the floor by the door. They left tracks, a light cart, 1 man. The same as at the valve, no? These were different, sloppier. But the tracks, they lead toward Box Canyon. Box Canyon. Even Eliza had heard the name. A maze of rocks and dead-end gullies. A favorite hiding place for drifters and rustlers. Rowan strapped his gun belt back on. "I'll ride out at first light." "You'll be riding into a trap," Eliza said flatly. He turned, annoyed. "I know my land, but I know ledgers," she countered. She unrolled a large, yellowed survey map from a tube on the shelf, one she'd seen but never touched. She spread it on the kitchen table, weighing the corners down. "Crow and the sheriff want you to go to the valve. The rock was to scare me. The theft is to make you angry. They want you to ride into Box Canyon in a rage." She put her finger on the map. "This is the main trail. It's a choke point. They'll be waiting up here, in the rocks." Her finger then traced a thin, wavering line along a high ridge to the south. "But this is an old surveyor's trail. It's longer, but it brings you above the canyon. You'll have the high ground. You'll see them long before they ever hear you coming." It was the first time they had ever truly planned together. Rowan stared at the map. He looked at her small, pale finger, now resting confidently on the paper, and then back at her face. The single oil lamp on the table cast their shadows, long and dark, against the cabin wall. The shadows stood close, shoulders nearly touching. 2 figures joined by the pool of light, united over the map. They weren't touching, not by a foot, but the air between them was hot, charged with something new. It wasn't just fear, and it wasn't just alliance. It was the sharp, palpable heat of 2 forces, finally pointing in the same direction. The whispers of Silas Crow's ambition were no longer confined to the Silver Kettle Saloon. They had taken root in the Sagebrush Vale Hotel, spoken aloud in the clear light of day. Crow was courting progress, or at least his version of it. He had gathered the town's handful of merchants, Sylvie March among them, looking non-committal to propose a future built on steel and steam. "The Mesquite Spur," he announced, his large, ringed hand sweeping across a map. "A rail line connecting us to the main artery. It means cheaper goods, faster transport, and land values that will double, gentlemen, double his audience. Men who counted their wealth in dry goods and cattle, leaned in, but the railroad needs water." Crow continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "More than our small wells can provide. They need a guarantee. They need the steady, reliable flow of the Willow Draw." He tapped the map, his finger landing squarely on the parcel labeled Painted Arrow Ranch. "This tank, this single, private tank, is the bottleneck. It's 1 man, hoarding the lifeblood of this entire valley. I am in negotiations to secure those rights for the good of all Copper Mesa County. Once I do, the railroad has promised to break ground by spring. I promise you, gentlemen and ladies, cheap water and a shared prosperity." The seed was planted. Rowan Cade was no longer just a reclusive rancher. He was an obstacle. Eliza heard the talk when she went for supplies. She felt the change in the air. The stares were no longer just curious. They were assessing, calculating. She had her own business to attend to. She walked into Sheriff Burke Holliday's office with a manufactured air of distressed civility. "Sheriff, I'm afraid I need to file a formal complaint, she said, her voice pitched just right, regarding the theft of property from the Painted Arrow Ranch. Holiday, as expected, was leaning back in his chair, boots on his cluttered desk. More troubles. Ma'am, look, like I told Mr. Cade, a few sacks of oats, it's probably just drifters. They're long gone by now. There's not a thing I can do. I understand, Eliza said, her eyes scanning the chaos of his desk. But for our own records, I'd like it noted. I've written it down. She handed him a sheet of paper. As he took it, he grunted, shifting his weight, and a stack of papers slid from the desk, scattering across the floor. Damnation, he muttered, not moving. Oh, let me help you, Eliza said, kneeling before he could protest. She gathered the wanted posters, the tax receipts, the stacks of trivial complaints. She was quick, her movements efficient, the dutiful woman. And then she saw it. It wasn't a document. It was a folded, oil-stained hunter's map of the county. She picked it up, and as she did, her fingers brushed the pencil markings on the back. It wasn't a map legend. It was script. Her eyes flicked over it in half a second, her mind recording it instantly, the way it recorded every line in her ledgers. You, payable to S. Crow, on demand, sum of $500, interest at 10%. It was signed with a flourish, Burke Holiday. Sheriff, $500. It was more than the sheriff made in a year. It was a chain, heavy and invisible, linking this office directly to Silas Crow. She calmly placed the map back on the stack and handed it to him. You should be more careful. Sheriff, this looks important. Holiday snatched it, his face flushing a dull red as he saw what she held. He quickly tucked it under his blotter. Thank you, ma'am. I'll file your report. Eliza left the office, her mind cold and clear. The law in Sagebrush Vale wasn't just indifferent. It was owned. She went, as she often did, to Sylvie March's. The fabric shop was the only place in town that felt quiet, the only place where she wasn't openly analyzed. Sylvie was measuring a length of blue calico. He's got them all dreaming of locomotives, Sylvie said, not looking up. He's promising them water he doesn't own, Eliza replied, running her hand over a bolt of wool. And you have a piece of paper that says he can't. I heard word gets around. A copy, Eliza clarified. It's enough to make him pause, but he'll just claim it's a forgery. Sylvie snipped the fabric with a loud thwack of her shears. She folded it, her movements precise. You've got the town ledger, but you don't have Maeve's. Maeve Alton. The notary on your paper. Sylvie leaned forward, her voice dropping. Maeve never trusted the county clerk, never trusted anyone. Said the council was full of fools who used cheap ink. For 40 years, she kept her own logs, a complete, handwritten, duplicate record of every transaction, every deed, every permit she ever stamped. Eliza's heart gave a single, hard thump. Where is she retired? Lives out in Juniper Wash. It's a 2-day ride. She's old, mean as a cornered badger, and her mind as sharp as her tongue. If that clause is real, Maeve Alton will have the original ink to prove it. This was the key, the real evidence. When she returned to the ranch, she found Rowan not mending fences, but setting new ones. He was driving heavy cedar posts deep into the ground, stretching new, viciously sharp-tined barbed wire. It was a clear, physical message. This is mine. Keep out. He stopped when she rode up. He looked at her, then walked to the small shed by the barn. He returned, carrying the Henry. It was a .44 caliber repeating rifle, its brass receiver gleaming dully, its walnut stock dark and oiled. It looked heavy and deadly. He handed it to her. But first, Eliza, surprised, took it. It was heavy, heavier than she'd imagined. You're going to learn, he said. It wasn't a request. I don't know how. I know. That's why I'm teaching. He pointed to a row of tin cans he had set on the far corral fence, a good 50 yards away. Lift it? She raised it to her shoulder. The iron was cold against her cheek. The weight awkward. No, he said. His voice wasn't mean, but it was strict. The voice of a man who understood the tool. Don't just hold it. Own it. Pull it tight into your shoulder. tight, so it's part of you. If it's loose, it'll kick you hard enough to break your collarbone. Pull it in, she repositioned, jamming the curved brass butt plate into the hollow of her shoulder. Breathe, he commanded. Let half of it out. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Squeeze it like you're squeezing a lemon dry. Eliza sighted down the long barrel. The small can seemed impossibly far. She held her breath, squeezed. The crack of the rifle was a physical blow. It was a roar that filled the world, slamming into her. A concussive force. The kick, even though she'd braced for it, was brutal. It punched her shoulder hard, and she stumbled back. Dust kicked up a good 5 feet to the left of the can. Again, he said, his voice completely calm. She flushed, her shoulder already aching, her ears ringing. I know. You jerked at the last second. You were afraid of it. Don't be afraid of it. Control it. It does what you tell it. Again. She loaded another cartridge, the brass shell feeling slick in her trembling hand. She raised the rifle, pulled it tight. Breathe out. Squeeze. Crack. Closer. The can didn't move. Again, she fired and fired. The rhythm of it began to take over. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder. The sharp, mechanical click-clack of the lever action as she ejected a spent shell and loaded a new one. The solid, painful thump against her shoulder. And with every shot, the fear that had lived in her throat for a year, the fear of smoke, of breaking glass, of loud noises was being hammered, beaten back, replaced by a cold, hard focus. Crack! Ping! The can jumped, spinning off the fence rail. A sharp, involuntary breath of triumph escaped her. She lowered the rifle, her shoulders screaming, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange, fierce power. Rowan allowed himself a small, tight nod. Good. Now the next one. The war of preparation was matched by a war of words in town. That night, the silver kettle was packed. Silas Crow, flush with his railroad victory, was buying drinks for all his men. To progress he roared, raising his whiskey glass. His men, a rough collection of hired hands and drifters, cheered. They say Cade has a piece of paper, Crow laughed, a piece of paper in the East. Maybe they listen to paper, but this is the West, and out here, there's only 2 laws that matter. He slapped the heavy pistol on his hip with one hand and jingled the gold coins in his pocket with the other. Guns and gold. That's the law, and the water belongs to the man who can hold it. The saloon erupted. Eliza saw it all from the shadows of the boardwalk. She wasn't watching Crow. She was watching a man slide out of the saloon, counting a few coins. It was Tobin Vale, the lanky, shifty-eyed man she'd seen watching the sheriff's office. He was a known gambler, a man who, Sylvie had once remarked, would sell his own grandmother for a stack of blue chips. Eliza intercepted him in the dark alley between the saloon and the land office. "Mr. Vale," she said, her voice making him jump. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes narrowing, recognizing her. "Shouldn't be back here. It ain't safe. Neither is working for Silas Crow." Vale stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean," Eliza said, stepping closer, "that I understand you are a man who brokers sensitive items. Paper, for instance." Vale's hand twitched toward his vest. "I just play cards. You play cards, and you buy debts. I am given to understand that Sheriff Holliday has a rather large note, one held by Mr. Crow." Vale was silent, his face a mask. "Mr. Crow is busy with his railroad. He's rich. He probably doesn't even remember that old piece of paper, but I imagine it's a burden for a man like Holliday, and perhaps an asset for a man like you. If you could get your hands on it." He licked his lips. "Hypothetically, what if I could hypothetically?" Eliza said. "I would pay for it. Cash." Vale gave a short, ugly laugh. "That's a $500 note." "Ma'am, it's a $500 lever," Eliza corrected him, her voice cold. "It's not currency. He'll never collect it. It's only good as long as Holliday is sheriff, and only good to Crow. It's worthless to anyone else." "So what's it worth to you, $300? She said. Vale considered it. "Quick, clean cash versus the risk of double-crossing Crow. $400? he countered. 350, Eliza said. Right now. Or I can walk into that saloon and tell Silas Crow that his man Tobin Vale is out here trying to sell his private insurance policy. I wonder what that would be worth to him. Vale's face went pale. He knew Crow's temper. You're a hard woman, ma'am. I'm a desperate woman. Mr. Vale, do we have a deal? Meet me back here in 10 minutes? With the cash, he slipped away. Eliza's heart was hammering harder than when she'd fired the rifle. This was the true gamble. She reached beneath her dress, to the money belt she had worn every day since she'd left her ruined home. This was her starting over money, her escape fund, everything she had. She counted it out in the dark. $350. Vale returned, passing her the stained, folded hunting map. She passed him the cash. The exchange was done. She owned Burke Holiday. She didn't wait. She walked straight to the sheriff's office. He was still there, the lamp lit, his boots on the desk. She slammed the map down on the blotter, on top of his hand. He yelped, sitting bolt upright. He looked at the map, his eyes wide with terror. What, how it's done? Eliza said, her voice shaking with a cold rage. I own this, which means I own you. Now, ma'am, listen here, he blustered, trying to stand. No, you listen, she snapped. You don't owe Silas Crow another minute of your time. You don't owe him your loyalty. You don't owe him your silence. As of this moment, Sheriff, you owe me. He stared at her, speechless. And I'm collecting my debt, she said, leaning in. You are going to do your job. You are going to follow the law. You are going to be the sheriff this county is supposed to have. You don't owe Crow, and you don't owe me. You only owe the badge on your chest. Am I clear, Holiday? Trapped, sweating, could only nod. Good, Eliza said. She left the map on his desk. A reminder. The blowback was immediate. Word of the sheriff's sudden, spine-stiffening rejection of Crow's requests spread through town. And with it, a new rumor. Rowan heard it at the feed store. Heard Crow's bringing in the Coyote Jack gang. The clerk told him, his voice low, they ain't just thugs. Cade, they're night raiders. Mean, they like fire. Rowan's face hardened. He bought his supplies and left. When he got back to the ranch, he told Eliza, the war was no longer about paper. They'll come at night, he said. Try to burn the barn, scatter the stock, create chaos, like the rock through my window, Eliza said, her hand unconsciously touching her bandaged wrist, bigger. They worked together as the sun set, the sky a deep, bloody orange. They took old tin cans from the refuse pile, filled them with pebbles. They strung thin, nearly invisible tripwires all around the perimeter of the barn, the house, and the corral, tying them to the cans. It was a simple system, crude but effective. Anyone approaching in the dark would announce themselves with a deafening rattle. Their hands brushed as they worked in the twilight, a shared, silent tension that was more intimate than any touch. They finished, exhausted, and walked back to the porch. A small, woven basket sat by the front door. I didn't put that there, Eliza said. Rowan tensed, holding her back. He nudged the basket with his boot. Nothing. He carefully lifted the cloth covering. It was full of beautiful, red apples. Tucked into the side was a folded piece of paper. Eliza pulled it out. Don't trust Cade. He's not what he seems. His first wife learned the hard way. Leave while you can. The anonymous warning. The rumor from her first day. Give a new, venomous life. An attempt to shatter the one alliance she had. She stood frozen, the paper trembling in her hand. Rowan watched her. His face was impossible to read, his gray eyes veiled. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't deny it. He just waited, letting the poison do its work. He held out his hand for the note. Eliza gave it to him. He read it, his expression not changing, though a muscle in his scarred cheek tightened. Then, with a quiet snort of contempt, he crumpled it in his fist. I trust what I do, he said, his voice low. He nodded toward the new fences, the wires, the barn. This is real. Words are wind. He looked at her, his gaze intense, waiting for her to pull away. to run, to prove the note right. Eliza looked at the crumpled paper. She thought of the $500 Holiday owed. She thought of the $350 she'd just spent her entire future. She had bet everything. And the people we choose, she said, her voice quiet, but firm as the bedrock beneath their feet. It was the first time she had said we. Rowan's gaze held hers. The tension in his shoulders eased. Just a fraction. He gave a single, slow nod. The lines had been drawn. They were on the same side. The moon was a sharp, silver sliver, thin as a fingernail paring, offering just enough light to turn the world a stark monochrome of black and pale gray. The ranch was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. Not the peaceful, empty quiet of the high desert, but a held breath, a predator's silence. Inside the main room, it was pitch black. They had doused the kitchen lamp 2 hours ago. Rowan sat in the chair by the window, a dark shape against the lesser dark. Eliza was on the floor, her back against the wall by the hallway, the heavy .44 caliber Henry rifle resting across her knees. It was cold, and it felt impossibly heavy, a solid, brutal piece of iron. They didn't speak, they just waited. The sound, when it came, was not what she expected. It wasn't a gunshot or a yell. It was a faint, metallic clatter-clack-clack. One of the tin cans. Rowan was on his feet in one silent motion. He didn't speak. He held up a hand, a command for stillness, then pointed to the kitchen lamp. He moved to it, and with a pinch of his fingers, the small pilot wick was extinguished. The room plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. He moved past her, his boot brushing her skirt. He was just a presence, a faint smell of leather and dust in the dark. He put his mouth close to her ear, his whisper a mere vibration in the air. Stay by the wall. Do not move unless you have to. If they light the torch, you use the rope. You understand? She nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Good girl, he breathed. And he was gone, melting through the front door into the moon-cast shadows of the porch. Eliza's throat closed. The smell of smoke was already in her mind, a phantom from her past. It's just noise. You are safe. She forced her breathing to steady. In for 4, out for 4. She gripped the rifle, pulling the stock tight into her shoulder, just as he'd taught her. Own it. Don't be afraid of it. She heard them now. The scrape of a boot on rock. A low, guttural laugh. They were over the berm, moving from the cover of the dry wash. They weren't being quiet. They were arrogant. This is it, a voice whispered. Sharp and mean. Durney wants the barn first. Smoke 'em out. What about Cade? Another voice. Younger, nervous. Cade's one man. You see him. You shoot. Easy pay. They were moving toward the barn. 3, maybe 4 shadows detaching from the greater shadow of the cottonwood tree. They were sloppy, making noise, confident in their numbers. Eliza's eyes were wide, adjusting to the dark. She saw one man break off, heading toward the horse corral. He was going to scatter the stock. He passed the corner of the barn. He was near the second wire. Eliza crawled, silent as a spider, along the wall. Her hand found the coarse twine they had rigged, leading from the porch, along the wall, to a post inside the barn. Tied to it was a heavy, tangled nest of old cast-iron pots and tin buckets, balanced precariously on a high shelf just above the stalls. The man fumbled with the corral gate. Eliza pulled the twine. She yanked it hard, with all her strength. The sound was not a rattle. It was a catastrophe. A deafening, metallic avalanche of iron and tin crashed onto the hard-packed earth of the barn floor. It was a sound of pure, sudden chaos, amplified by the wooden walls. The horses, already on edge, exploded. Quiver. The filly let out a high-pitched, terrifying scream and kicked the side of her stall with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. Ash reared, neighing, his hooves drumming against the wood. The raiders froze. What in blazes was that? It's an ambush. They're in the barn, where I can't see nothing. In the instant of their confusion, a shadow detached itself from the side of the porch. Rowan moved with a speed Eliza could not have imagined. He wasn't a rancher. He was a hunter. He closed the 10 yards to the nearest man. who was still staring, panicked. At the barn, there was no gunshot, just the solid, sickening thud of the rifle stock meeting the man's side, a sharp grunt, and the sound of a body slumping, heavy and limp, into the dust. One of the other men, near the hay pile, heard it. He spun, panicked, and raised his pistol toward the sound. Who's there? He was silhouetted against the pale gray sky. A perfect target. Eliza's heart stopped. He's going to shoot Rowan. She raised the Henry. She didn't think. She just acted. Pull it tight. Breathe out. She didn't aim at the man. She aimed above him. At the sky. Squeeze. Crack. The rifle exploded against her shoulder. It was a cannon shot. A physical blow that punched the air from her lungs and slammed her back against the wall. The muzzle flash, a brilliant, blinding flower of orange-white fire, lit the entire yard for one terrible, frozen second. In that flash, she saw it all, Rowan, already over the first man, crouching like a mountain lion. The second man, arm raised, pistol gleaming, and the third man, the leader, his face a mask of fury. Jack Durney. The flash and the sheer deafening roar of the .44 broke their nerve. It wasn't one man with a pistol. It was a heavy-caliber rifle. It was an ambush. Fall back. Fall back, the nervous one yelled, scrambling backward. But Jack Durney was not a coward. He was fueled by rage. You want to fight? Cade, he roared, his voice cracking. You'll get one. He scrambled back, but not toward his horse. He fumbled in his coat, pulling out a long stick tipped with a thick, oil-soaked rag. He struck a sulfur match against his boot. The scrape was loud and the torch flared to life. If we can't have the water, no one will. He screamed. He drew his arm back and hurled the torch in a high, spinning arc. Eliza watched it fly, a small, fiery comet against the black sky. It landed with a soft whoomph directly in the loose pile of dry hay stacked by the barn door. The hay caught instantly. The small flame became a bonfire in a single breath. A wall of orange light shot up, casting wild, dancing shadows, illuminating the entire ranch, and the smell hit her. Not the faint, old char of the canyon. This was new, acrid, choking, greedy. The smell of burning straw, of hot wood, the smell of Lily, the smoke, the hot, heavy blanket. I can't breathe. She was frozen. Her lungs seized. The rifle suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. She couldn't move. She was back in the alley, the heat on her face, the screams in her ears. Eliza Rowan's voice. He was yelling. He had his hands full with the man he'd taken down, who was now fighting back. The firelight illuminated his face, strained and desperate. He couldn't get to the fire. The sight of him, of Rowan, fighting. Now, cut through the panic, the memory shattered. This was not the past. This was not the warehouse. I am not that girl. She dropped the rifle. By the corral, not 10 feet away, was the long water trough for the horses. She didn't run from the fire. She ran at it. She grabbed one of the heavy wooden buckets they used for grain and plunged it into the trough. The cold water shocked her arms. It was impossibly heavy. She heaved it, staggering, and threw the entire contents at the base of the fire. A furious hissing explosion. A column of thick, white, choking steam billowed up, momentarily blinding her. The flame sank, beaten, but the hay was still a glowing, angry red. She turned to go back for more. Her eyes were streaming. The smoke was thick, stinging, making her cough, but her hands were not shaking. A new sound. Not gunfire. Hoofbeats. Fast. Too many. They're coming back, she yelled, dropping the bucket. But the voice that called out was not Jack Durney's. Sheriff's office, in the name of the county. Drop your weapons. 3 riders thundered into the yard. Shotguns held high. Sheriff Burke Holliday, his face grim in the firelight, and 2 deputies she'd never seen. They fanned out, their horses wheeling, their weapons aimed. Jack Durney, who had been scrambling for another torch, froze. His remaining man, the nervous one, threw his pistol down immediately. Don't shoot, I'm out. Durney looked at the sheriff, at the 2 deputies, at Rowan, who now had his man subdued, and at Eliza, who was standing, covered in soot, by the smoldering hay pile. The fight was over. He cursed, a long, vile string of words, and sprinted for the darkness of the dry wash. "He's getting away," one deputy yelled. "Let him go." Holiday grunted, dismounting. "He's running to Box Canyon. He's got nowhere else to go. We've got these two." Holiday walked over, his eyes taking in the scene, the tied-up raider, the one with his hands in the air, the smoldering hay, the broken window, and Eliza, still catching her breath. He nodded to the deputy. "Cuff 'em." He then looked at Rowan, and finally, at Eliza. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Mr. Cade. Seems you filed that complaint just in time. Gave me cause to be in the neighborhood." He wasn't servile. He wasn't friendly. He was a man doing his job, and he was making sure they knew it. They watched as the deputies loaded the two men, grumbling and bound, onto their horses. Holiday kicked the remains of the hay pile, making sure the embers were dead. "Crow won't like this," he muttered, more to himself than to them. Then he mounted up. "I'll post a deputy at the edge of your land till sunup. But this ain't over. Be smart." He rode off, the sound of the hooves fading. Silence, sudden and absolute, descended on the Painted Arrow. The only sounds were the drip, drip of water from the bucket and the nervous stamping of the horses in the barn. The adrenaline drained away, leaving Eliza's knees weak. She looked down at her hands. In the pale, pre-dawn light, she could see them. They were vibrating, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. A sound bubbled up in her chest. It was a laugh, a dry, ragged, half-sobbing sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "My hands," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She held them out. "They won't stop shaking. But I didn't run." Rowan was leaning against the porch rail, reloading the cartridge he'd spent. He finished, the click of the mechanism sounding loud in the quiet. He looked at her, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes in shadow. He looked at her, standing tall amid the mess, covered in soot, smelling of smoke. "I saw," he said. The two words were heavy. They were everything. They spent the last hour before dawn in the barn, calming the horses. The smell of smoke and fear lingered. Quiver was still trembling. Her hide slick. "Easy, girl," Eliza murmured, stroking the filly's neck. "It's all over." She was checking the saddle in the next stall, which had been knocked askew in the panic. Her hands, still shaking, fumbled with the heavy leather buckle. "Here." Rowan's voice was behind her. He reached past her, his body brushing her shoulder. His large, steady hands took the strap. As he threaded the buckle, the back of his fingers, calloused and warm, brushed the back of her hand. It was not a caress. It was an accident. It felt like a lightning strike, a small, sharp spark that jumped from his skin to hers. Eliza snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. Rowan flinched, pulling his own hand away. His work half finished. A terrible, charged silence filled the small stall. Eliza immediately turned, her back to him, and began to busy herself brushing Quiver's mane with frantic, unnecessary strokes. Rowan cleared his throat. I'll check the far fence line." He was gone. They didn't speak of it. They couldn't. At sunrise, they saddled Ash and Quiver. The house was a wreck. The yard was a mess. But they both felt the desperate, unspoken need to get away, to breathe air that wasn't stale with fear and smoke. They rode out, not speaking, letting the horses pick their way toward the high ground. They rode to Willow Draw. It was like a different world. Up here, the night's chaos hadn't touched a single leaf. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The water of the spring was sharp and clear, gurgling over the rocks. Eliza slid from the saddle, her body aching. She knelt by the stream, plunged her hands in, and splashed the icy water onto her face. It washed away the soot, the grit, the smell of the fire. It felt like a baptism. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up. Rowan was still mounted on Ash, watching her. His face, in the clear, golden morning light, was unguarded. The tension was gone. The scar looked softer. He wasn't looking at a mail-order bride, or a helper, or an ally. He was just looking at her. He dismounted, letting Ash drink. They sat on a flat rock, the sun warming their backs. The silence stretched, but it was no longer the tense silence of waiting. It was the heavy silence of after. "The rumor," he said, his voice quiet, making her jump. "About my first wife." Eliza tensed. "You don't have to." "Yeah," he said, his gaze on the water. "I do." He picked up a flat, gray stone. "It wasn't what they say, not all of it. I didn't hurt her, but she ran, and I don't blame her." He took a breath. "After the war. I wasn't a rancher. I was adrift. I signed on with a freight outfit. Turned out the man I worked for didn't much care what was in the wagons, or who was in his way. We were persuading folks to sell their claims. A family of migrants. From Germany. They wouldn't move." His voice went flat. "Dead. My boss, he gave the order to burn them out, to fire into their wagons to get them moving. Said it was just to scare 'em." He closed his eyes. "Just for a second. I couldn't. I pulled my horse. I stood between them. My own men, they called it disobeying a direct order. They called it treason. My wife. Anna, she was from a good family back east. She came out here thinking it was an adventure. She hadn't signed on for that. For being married to a man who'd been branded a coward by his own side. A man who put strangers before his own payroll." He tossed the stone. It skipped twice, then sank. Plunk. She couldn't take the whispers. The danger. She left in the night. That part's true. That's the half of it they don't tell in the saloon. Eliza watched the ripples spread. He, the man branded for not being violent. She looked down at her own hands. Now clean. But the memory of the tremor was still in her muscles. "I don't hate fire," she said, her voice so low he leaned in to hear. He looked at her, confused. "I hate smoke." She pulled her knees to her chest. "The fire, the one I fled. It was a warehouse, next to our tenement. It took my mother and my sister, Lily." Her voice was flat, a recitation of a fact she had worn smooth. "I was there. I was holding her hand. But the smoke, it was so thick. Black. People were screaming, pushing. I lost her. I fell. I was pushed. Out into the alley. I got out." She looked at him, her eyes clear, but filled with an old, cold, permanent storm. "They didn't." She touched a small, dark ember stain on her sleeve, a souvenir from the hay. "The last time I smelled smoke like that, I was on the train, pulling out of the station. It was in my clothes, in my hair. I thought I'd be running from that smell forever." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Last night I smelled it, and I ran right at it, and it just smelled like hay." He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer pity. He just held her gaze, and for the first time she saw the man behind the scar, the man who had also stood his ground when it mattered. He gave a single, slow nod. He, the man who had refused to fire. She, the woman who finally had. They sat in the quiet of the morning, two halves of two different, broken stories, and in the silence of the willow draw, they fit together. Not perfect, but whole. Two pieces of scarred wood, joined tight, no nails needed. The sky had turned a sickly, greenish yellow, the color of an old bruise. They had ridden out to the northern fence line, the one that bordered the dry wash, to check the damage from Durney's men. The tripwires were broken, the cans scattered. It was a violation, and the air itself felt charged, static, holding its breath. "We should head back," Rowan said, his eyes on the horizon. The air smelled of ozone and hot dust. "That's not a shower. That's a gully washer." He was right. Before they were halfway back to the ridge, the first drops hit. They were not small. They were heavy, cold, and sparse, kicking up explosions of dust where they landed. A minute later, the sky opened. It was not rain. It was a deluge, a solid, driving sheet of water that blurred the world into a gray, roaring chaos. The wind hit them like a physical blow, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The line shack, Rowan yelled over the wind, pointing to a small, dark shape huddled under a bluff of rock. "We can't make it to the house." He spurred Ash, and Eliza, soaked to the skin in seconds, urged Quiver after him. They tumbled from the horses, tying the reins to the small porch rail. The animals turning their backs to the wind, heads down, miserable. Rowan put his shoulder to the line shack's swollen door and shoved it open. They fell inside, the door slamming shut behind them, cutting the roar of the wind to a deafening, hollow drumming on the tin roof. For a moment, they just stood in the dim, gray light, dripping, breathing hard. The shack was tiny, barely 12 feet square. It smelled of old wood, rust, and the faint, dry scent of mouse leavings. In one corner stood a small, pot-bellied stove, cold and dark. In the other, a narrow iron cot with a single, musty-looking blanket folded at its foot. "You're soaked," Rowan stated, his voice quiet in the sudden confines of the room. He ran a hand through his wet hair, slicking it back. "So are you," Eliza replied, her teeth beginning to chatter. She hugged herself, trying to stop the shivering. Her thin cotton shirt was plastered to her. Useless. He didn't hesitate. He moved to the stove, his movements all business. "There's kindling in the box. Get your coat off. You'll catch your death." He busied himself with the stove, his back to her, granting her a small, practical privacy. Eliza peeled off her sodden riding jacket and hung it on a nail by the door, her fingers numb. He hung his own beside it, a heavy canvas coat that dripped a puddle onto the floorboards. He struck a match, and the kindling caught with a soft whoosh. The small stove began to tick and ping as it warmed. The sound of the rain on the roof was relentless, a hollow, frantic drumming, like 100 jungle drums, isolating them, sealing them in. He found a crate with a few dry goods, a half-empty sack of coffee, some tins, and a clean, folded towel. He tossed it to her. "Dry your hair, at least." He turned back to the stove, adding larger pieces of wood. Eliza, her back to him, unpinned her hair, which fell in a heavy, wet mass. She toweled it roughly, her hands shaking, not just from the cold. The small, enclosed space was filling with the smell of the fire clean. Resinous pine. She finished, her hair still damp, and turned. He was standing by the fire, feeding it. The warmth was beginning to fill the room, pushing back the damp. He had his own towel and was drying his face and neck. "Here," she said, her voice small. She held out the towel she had used. For you." He turned. He had unbuttoned the wet collar of his chambray shirt. The firelight, the only real light in the room, flickered and danced. It caught the thin, white line of his scar, making it glow, a pale silver against the warm bronze of his skin. Eliza's eyes fixed on it. It wasn't ugly, she realized. It was just part of him, a map of the life he'd lived. She had looked away from it the first day. Now, she couldn't. She looked from the scar to his eyes. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Her hand, the one holding the towel, was still outstretched, and it was shaking. He saw it. His gaze dropped to her trembling fingers. He didn't take the towel. He just looked at her hand, and his face softened. Just a fraction. Eliza felt a flush creep up her neck. Embarrassed by the show of weakness, she started to pull her hand back. It's just the cold, I know," he said, his voice quiet. He turned back to the fire, giving her a moment, pretending he hadn't seen. But she didn't retreat. The small room, the roar of the rain, the shared warmth. It was a spell. She found herself taking a single, unconscious step closer to the stove, closer to him. The rain hammered the roof, a wall of sound. They stood side by side, watching the small, bright flames lick the wood. "What if I hadn't come?" she asked, the question slipping out, almost carried away by the noise. He was silent for a long time, his profile stark in the firelight. She wasn't sure he'd heard her. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice a low rumble beneath the drumming rain. He turned a small log over with the poker. "I suppose I'd still be building fences. I'd still be checking the water. A man's work doesn't stop because he's lonely." He set the poker down and looked into the flames. "I reckon I'd just be waiting for something good. I just didn't know what I was waiting for." The confession hung in the warm air. thick with the smell of rain and pine. The space between them, which had been a safe, respectful distance, was suddenly charged. It was barely an arm's length. She could feel the heat radiating not just from the stove, but from his body. She could see the fine, dark hairs on his forearm, the way the muscles shifted as he breathed. His hand was resting on the rough wooden mantle of the stove, the hand that had taught her the bowline, the hand that had bandaged her wrist, the hand that had brushed hers in the barn, sending that jolt through her. She looked at it, a strong hand, a capable hand, a hand that had, so far, only ever been gentle with her. She was so tired of being afraid. Slowly, deliberately, Eliza lifted her own hand, the one that had been shaking. It was steady now. She reached out across the small, charged space and laid her fingers, cool and damp, on the back of his warm, dry hand. He went absolutely still. He didn't breathe. He didn't move a muscle. He was a man braced for a blow, or a miracle. He didn't pull away. He didn't grab her. He just waited. He turned his head, slowly. His neck corded. His gray eyes, burning in the firelight, found hers. They were wide, vulnerable, and they held one desperate question. Are you sure Eliza's throat was dry? She couldn't speak. She held his gaze, and with a small, almost imperceptible movement, she nodded. A breath he hadn't known he was holding escaped him. A long, quiet sigh. He turned his hand, slowly, under hers. His calloused fingers threaded through her own, enveloping them in a grip that was not possessive, but absolute. It was a promise. It was an anchor. It was the feeling of the bowline knot, the one that holds, the one that won't slip. Eliza felt she could finally breathe, all the way down, her entire chest expanding. He didn't pull her closer. He just held her hand, his thumb stroking softly over her knuckles. He took one step, closing the last of the distance between them. She did not step back. He was so tall. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. He looked at her eyes, then at her mouth, then back to her eyes. He was giving her every chance to flee, to turn her head, to say no. She waited. He leaned down, his movement agonizingly slow. He didn't kiss her, not really. He pressed his lips, warm and firm and chapped from the wind, to the corner of her mouth. It was a touch so gentle, so respectful. It almost broke her heart. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of promise. His other hand, the one that was free, came up. It didn't go to her hair or her neck. It settled, broad and warm, on the small of her back, his palm resting flat against the damp fabric. It was not a pull. It was a support, a gesture that said, I am here. I am not going anywhere. He drew back, but only an inch. Their foreheads touched. He closed his eyes. A small, shaky laugh rumbled in his chest. Eliza, he whispered, his voice rough. Don't, she whispered back, her voice catching. Don't rush. I'm not rushing, he murmured, his breath warm on her cheek, smelling of coffee in the clean rain. I'm just right here. This was her choice. This was the moment. She rose on her toes, just slightly. Her arms, which had been pinned between them, came up. She looped them, slowly, around his strong neck. She felt the coiled strength in his shoulders, the steady, solid thump, thump, thump of his heart against her own. She pressed her face into the curve of his neck, into the warm, damp skin. He smelled of pine smoke and wet canvas, and something that was just fundamentally Rowan. He held her. He just held her, his hand on her back, his other hand still laced in hers, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood like that for a long time, two quiet, breathing shapes in the firelight, while the storm raged outside, drumming on the roof, sealing them in. The world was washed away. There was no Silas Crow. There was no burning hay, no broken glass. There was only the sound of the rain, the crackle of the fire, and the two heartbeats, finding a shared, steady rhythm. Later, When the fire had burned down to embers and the rain had softened to a steady, quiet drumming, they sat. There was the single cot, but neither of them looked at it. He took the thick, musty wool blanket from its foot, shook it out hard, and wrapped it around both of their shoulders as they sat on the floor, their backs against the rough-hewn wall. He kept her hand in his. They didn't talk much. They just were. They listened to the storm dying. They watched the embers glow. He told her about the way the soil smelled. Just before a storm like this, she told him about the way the foghorns sounded. Back east, on the harbor. Small, quiet things. Outside, the rain was washing the dust from the valley. Inside, in the small, warm shack, they were washing the loneliness from each other. There was no fear in the small room. There was only choice. The first pale gray light of dawn was filtering through the single dirty window when the rain finally stopped. The world outside was dripping, scrubbed, and silent. They rode back to the Painted Arrow in a quiet that was no longer empty, but full. He left her at the porch. He had to tend to the horses, who were cold and unhappy. Eliza walked into the house, which felt large and empty after the tiny shack. She went to her room. The broken window was boarded up, a temporary patch against the night. She didn't change her clothes. She didn't rest. She walked to her valise, pulled out the purple-bound ledger and her small bottle of ink. She sat at the table. She dipped the pen, and in her neat, precise script, she wrote a new entry. August 16th, 1886. Last night. I was no longer a guest in this house. The ride to Juniper Wash took 2 full days, pushing southeast into a landscape that grew even more barren and unwelcoming. The alkali flats gave way to jagged volcanic rock and canyons so deep the sun never touched their bottoms. They rode in a comfortable silence, the kind that exists only after a storm has been weathered, the shared fear in the line shack, the confession by the stream it had forged something new. When his arm brushed hers as they rode, neither of them pulled away. When she passed him the canteen, their fingers lingered. Juniper Wash wasn't a town. It was a scar, a handful of dilapidated cabins clinging to the side of a sun-scorched ravine. It was a place people came to be forgotten. Maeve Alton's cabin was the last one, set apart, with a high fence made of sharpened juniper posts. Rowan dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Ma'am Maeve Alton, we're here on behalf of the Copper Mesa Council." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Then, a wooden shutter on a window scraped open, and the barrel of a shotgun poked out, glinting in the hot sun. "The council ain't had business with me in 15 years. A voice like grinding gravel snapped. "I paid my taxes. Get off my land before I plant you in it." "Ma'am," Eliza said, stepping forward, her hands raised and empty. Rowan tensed but didn't stop her. "My name is Eliza Hartwell. I'm from the Painted Arrow Ranch. We're not here about taxes. We're here about a water permit you notarized in 1879. The shotgun barrel didn't waver." "Don't know it. It has a perpetual renewal clause," Eliza said, her voice clear and carrying. "And a man named Silas Crow is trying to steal our land, claiming it's expired. He's filed a false document with the town." Another long, heavy pause. The shotgun barrel dipped, just slightly. "Crow," the voice spat. "That windbag. Always smelled of cheap cigars and hair tonic. You're Cade's new wife. Ain't you the mail-order one?" "I am," Eliza said, her chin high. Got more sand than his first one. I'll give you that." The shutter scraped again. "Wait there." A full 5 minutes passed. Eliza and Rowan exchanged a look. Finally, the heavy wooden door creaked open. Maeve Alton was a woman made of wire and rawhide. She was well past 70, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her gray hair pulled back in a severe, tight bun. She held the shotgun leveled at her hip. "If you're lying, I'll know, and I'll take it out of your hide. Mr. Cade." She led them inside. The cabin was immaculate, sparse, and smelled of wood smoke and old, dry paper. In the corner sat a heavy, dark wooden chest, bound in iron. Maeve knelt before it, pulling a large iron key from a chain around her neck. "The fools at the hall, they used ledgers bound in cheap glue," she muttered. lifting the heavy lid. "Bugs and mice ate 'em inside of 10 years. Mine are bound in pigskin and sealed." She pulled out a massive, leather-bound book. It looked more like a Bible than a ledger. She set it on the table with a heavy thud, the dust motes dancing in the single ray of light. On the cover, the year 1879 was tooled in faded gold. She thumbed through the thick, stiff pages until she found the one she wanted. The page itself was sealed to the next with a thick disc of red wax, now brittle and cracked with age. "This is the month in question," she said. "April." With a sharp, practiced movement, she broke the seal. Eliza leaned in, her heart hammering. The script was dense, but clear. And there it was. Permit 47, painted arrow, willow draw. She ran her finger down the page, to the section for addendums, and in the margin, in the same meticulous, spidery hand, was a single note. "Automatic renewal," Eliza read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "In perpetuity, unless public council certification of abandonment is filed and confirmed." "Which it never was," Rowan said, his voice flat. "No," Maeve snapped, "because you never abandoned it. That land's been worked since your daddy put the first spade in it." "He has a document," Eliza said, her mind racing, the pieces clicking into place. "In the town hall. He claims it's the abandonment certification. But it's a fake. It has to be." "How do you know?" Maeve asked, her eyes sharp. "The seal," Eliza said, thinking fast. "The copy I saw in the clerk's office, the town seal, it was off. The eagle's wing was canted. Maybe 7 or 8 degrees to the left. It wasn't set straight. And the ink, it was faded. Yes, but it was the wrong kind of fade. It was a chemical fade, not a time fade. It wasn't the right color for an iron gall ink from 1879. It was a forgery, a clumsy one." Maeve Alton looked at Eliza with a new respect. A bookkeeper and an eye for ink? "Well, all right. We're going to town. No one messes with my books." They rode back with Maeve, who sat astride her own mule like a cavalry general. They went straight to the town hall, marching into the clerk's office. Maeve slammed her ledger down on the counter, making the clerk jump. "Get me the council minutes for 1879, she commanded. "The original—" They cross-referenced the books. Eliza's original permit was there, just as it was in Maeve's ledger. "Now," Eliza said, her pulse quickening, "let's find the meeting where Crow filed his proof of abandonment. He claimed it was in the fall of 1884. They pulled the ledger for 1884. They found the date, and they found the page. It was gone. Not the whole page. A section. It had been neatly, or not so neatly, cut out with a blade, leaving a jagged, rectangular hole in the middle of the council minutes. I don't understand," the clerk stammered. "It was here. It must have been. It was never here," Maeve hissed. "This is where he put his forgery, and now he's removed it, to hide the evidence. It was a dead end. They had Maeve's book, but Crow's forgery was now gone, and so was the page he had tampered with. It was his word against theirs. Father always said Crow was a snake in a starched collar." The voice came from the doorway. Sylvie March stood there, holding a large, dusty cardboard box tied with twine. I heard the commotion. "Maeve, you look meaner than ever." "Sylvie, girl," Maeve grunted, nodding. "My father," Sylvie said, setting the box on the table, "was council secretary for 20 years. He was a meticulous man. He was also a suspicious one. He never trusted the copies kept in this cellar. He said the damp would ruin them. So he made his own copies. Of everything." She untied the twine. The box was filled with letters, loose papers, all tied in small, neat bundles. Eliza's hands itched to look. "He kept drafts," Sylvie explained, "of every letter he sent, every minute he recorded. I was cleaning out his old office and I found his bundle for 1884. Eliza's hands were shaking as she took the bundle. She untied the faded red ribbon, and there it was, a draft copy of the council minutes for the missing day. She scanned it. It was a standard meeting. Road repairs, a new tax, a dispute over a fence line. There was no mention of the painted arrow. No certification of abandonment. No filing from Silas Crow. The missing page hadn't contained a forgery. The forgery had been placed there. The real page, the one that proved nothing had happened, had been stolen and destroyed. And then, at the bottom of the draft, a small note in Sylvie's father's hand. Offered $50 to have a new filing for the Painted Arrow water rights misfiled into this day's minutes. Told him no. He was not pleased. I worry he will try another way. I am keeping this draft at home, just in case. This was it. This was the proof of intent. Sheriff Holliday, who had been standing in the doorway, watching, stepped forward. His face was a dark, thunderous red. He was no longer a man in Crow's pocket. He was an officer of the law, and his office, his town, had been corrupted. That, he said, his voice a low growl. His conspiracy to commit fraud. Mr. Clerk, give me a blank warrant. He dipped the pen, his large hand scraping across the paper. He signed it with a flourish. We are searching Crow stock and feed, top to bottom. The raid was fast. Rowan, the sheriff, and 2 new deputies went in the front. Eliza went with them, her ledger in her hand. Crow wasn't there, but his panicked clerk was. The back office, Eliza said, brushing past him. It was a disaster of manifests, receipts, and whiskey bottles. He's too smart to leave it in the safe, Eliza said, her eyes scanning. She looked at the desk. The blotter, the same place Holliday had hidden his IOU. She lifted it. Nothing. She ran her hand under the desk itself. Her fingers brushed a small, tacked-on leather pouch. She pulled it free. Inside was not the finished forgery. It was something better. It was a practice sheet. Dozens of attempts at forging the clerk's signature, and, in the corner, a list of words. And then, a full, handwritten draft of the fraudulent text for the council minutes. And there, clear as day, was the word abandonment, spelled with 2 N's. Sheriff, Eliza said, her voice quiet, her hand steady as she held up the paper. I believe you'll find this matches the spelling on the fraudulent document that was, until recently, in your files. It's enough, Holliday said, his voice grim. It's enough for a hearing. He's done. Word must have traveled faster than a telegraph. Crow knew he was cornered. A legal battle. He would now lose. He had 1 move left. Not paper. Violence. That night, Maeve was staying in the secure room above Sylvie's shop. Eliza and Rowan were taking turns on watch on the boardwalk outside. It was Rowan's turn. Eliza was across the street, in the hotel, watching from the window. She saw them. 3 shadows. They didn't come down the main street. They came over the rooftops. Coyote Jack Durney, his face a mask of rage, and 2 of his men. They dropped onto Sylvie's balcony, kicked in the door. Eliza screamed, "Rowan upstairs." By the time Rowan smashed through the front door of the shop, it was too late. They were gone, back over the roof. Sylvie was on the floor, dazed, a bruise on her cheek. They took her, she whispered, horrified. They took Maeve. They met in the sheriff's office, the lamp casting long, frantic shadows. He's gone to ground, the sheriff said. Box Canyon. He's gotta be. He'll use her as a hostage, Rowan said, his voice cold. He'll demand we drop the charges and give him the water rights in exchange for her life. The main road is a death trap. The sheriff said, he'll have lookouts. Eliza, her heart hammering, slammed her hand on the survey map. No, not the main road. He'll be slow. He has Maeve. He'll take the side route. Bad Coyote Wash. Rowan's eyes met hers. It's narrow, steep sides. We can get above them. It's an ambush, the sheriff said, nodding, grabbing a shotgun. Not an ambush, Rowan said. A rescue. We need her alive. We go in smart, not hard. They rode hard, the 3 of them, cutting across the high mesa, the wind whipping at them. They beat the sunrise. They left their horses a mile back and crawled on their bellies to the rim of Bad Coyote Wash. The sky was just turning a pale, sickly gray. And then they heard them, the clatter of hooves on loose rock. El Rowan raised his rifle. Below, 3 riders, Durney, 1 other man, and Maeve, slumped over the 3rd horse, tied to the saddle. I can hit the horses, Rowan whispered. It's a long shot, but I can do it. No, Eliza whispered back, her mind racing. If they fall, she falls. She could be hurt. We need a distraction, something to blind them. She looked at her saddlebag, which she'd dragged with her. The supplies Sylvie had packed, a small sack of flour, a bag of salt, and a small cloth bag of lime powder, meant for the ranch outhouse. She grabbed the bag of lime. Sheriff, the wind. It's moving down canyon, right at them. She looked at Rowan. When I throw, you yell, draw their eyes up. He nodded, a look of fierce, terrible pride on his face. Sheriff, Eliza said, you're loud. When they're blind, I need you to sound like 5 men. They waited. The riders were almost directly below. Now, Rowan said. He stood up. Durney, he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The 3 riders stopped, startled, their faces turning up. What the Durney yelled, reaching for his gun. Now! Sheriff Eliza screamed. She hurled the heavy cloth bag with all her strength. It landed on the rocks just in front of the lead horse. The bag burst, erupting in a thick, choking cloud of white powder. The wind caught it, carrying it straight into their faces. The men screamed. It was not a sound of pain, but of pure, panicked terror. They dropped their reins, clawing at their eyes. I can't see my eyes. The horses, spooked by the cloud and the screaming, reared and plunged. You're surrounded, Sheriff Holliday bellowed, his voice the roar of a cannon. Throw down your arms, we have 10 rifles on you. Rowan was already sliding down the shale slope, a rope in his hand, moving with the speed of a cat. He had the reins of Maeve's horse before the other men even knew what was happening. He cut her free, pulling her onto his own horse as the sheriff and his 1 deputy, who had come up the rear, charged in. It was over in 30 seconds. No one was shot. Durney and his man were on the ground, bound and still sputtering, their eyes washed out with water from a canteen. Their fight gone. Maeve, coughing and furious, sat on Rowan's horse. Took you long enough, she grumbled, but her hand found Eliza's and squeezed it. Hard. That was a dirty trick. Girl, I like it. They rode back into Sagebrush Vale in the full light of morning, with Maeve Alton riding triumphant and Jack Durney tied to his saddle. The townspeople, drawn by the commotion, lined the street. They saw the sheriff, tall in the saddle. They saw Rowan Cade, his face like stone. They saw the old woman, tougher than any of them. And they saw Eliza, covered in dust, her hair down, riding beside them. Not as a mail-order bride, but as their champion. Silas Crow, standing on the porch of the hotel, watched them pass. His face was the color of ash. He was alone. The men who had drunk his whiskey were silent, watching him. The tide had turned. The fight for the Painted Arrow was no longer a land dispute. It was a criminal matter. And Crow, trapped by his own web of paper and violence, was forced to stand trial. Granite Hall was suffocating. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the air was already hot, thick with the smell of unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. Every bench was packed. The ranchers, the merchants, the women of the town. Everyone who had a stake in the valley's future was there, their faces grim. At the front, Sheriff Burke Holliday sat behind a heavy oak table, looking uncomfortable in a starched collar. To his left sat Silas Crow, flanked by a slick-haired lawyer from the territorial capital, looking utterly unconcerned. To his right sat Eliza, Rowan, Maeve Alton, and Sylvie March. Rowan wasn't at the table. He stood against the back wall, his arms crossed, his gray eyes missing nothing. He was a pillar of quiet menace, his presence a silent promise. "We are convened," Holliday began, his voice booming, "to hear the dispute regarding the water rights of the Painted Arrow Ranch. Mr. Crow claims abandonment. Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Alton claim fraud." Crow's lawyer stood up, smooth as oiled silk. "Sheriff, this is a farce. My client filed the appropriate, notarized paperwork with the county, which was accepted. This counterclaim is based on the senile ramblings of a woman who hasn't been to town in a decade and a mail-order bride who clearly has undue influence over Mr. Cade. We ask for immediate dismissal. The council will hear the evidence," Holliday growled. his eyes on the IOU that he knew was in Eliza's possession. He was, for the first time, an impartial arm of the law. Mrs. Hartwell. Eliza stood. The room went silent. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman in a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back, her hands empty. She looked and felt small, but her voice, when she spoke, was not small. It was clear, precise, and cold as a winter morning. "This is not about influence. It is about ink," she began. She walked to the table and laid down the certified copy of the document Crow had filed. "Gentlemen, I ask you to look at the ink. I spent my life in the East, working with ledgers. I know the inks of our time. This," she pointed, "is a modern aniline ink, chemically aged with sulfurous acid to appear faded. It is not the iron gall ink used by this county in 1879. The color is wrong. The bleed is wrong." A murmur went through the crowd. "Second," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "the seal." She produced a letter from Sylvie's father, dated 1880, bearing the true county seal. "Look at the official seal. The eagle's wing is perfectly level. Now look at Mr. Crow's document. The seal is canted 7 degrees to the left. It is a competent forgery. But it is a forgery. It was not stamped by this office. It was stamped by a tool made to look like it." The murmur grew louder. Crow's lawyer jumped up. "Innuendo, conjecture, facts." Maeve Alton barked from her seat, her voice cutting through his. "And here are more." She stood and heaved her massive, pigskin-bound ledger onto the table with a thud that silenced the room. "This is my personal notary log, bound, sealed, and kept by me, safe from rats and corrupt fools. Here is the entry for April 3rd, 1879, the Painted Arrow permit. And here," she stabbed the page with a bony finger, "is the marginalia, the clause, in my own hand, from that day. Automatic renewal in perpetuity, unless public council certification of abandonment is filed and confirmed." She glared at the crowd. "I have sat on every council meeting for 30 years. No such certification was ever filed. Ever." Eliza stepped forward again. "And when we went to find the minutes for the date, Mr. Crow claims he filed, the page was missing, but we found the secretary's private draft copy." She held it up. "It contains no mention of the Painted Arrow. What it does contain is a note from Secretary March, stating that Silas Crow had offered him $50 to misfile a new claim. He was refused." The room exploded. "Fraud. He tried to buy the council Crow," his face purple, slammed his fist on the table and stood up, shoving his lawyer aside. "Silence, you fools. You're listening to a hysterical woman and an old hermit. You want to talk about paper." He sneered. "This isn't about paper. This is about the future." He turned from the table, his arms spread wide. Addressing the room, "The Mesquite Spur Railroad. They are waiting on me. They are waiting on the guarantee of that water. This is about progress. This is about prosperity for every man in this room. Cheap goods. Fast transport land values that will double. Are you going to let this Eastern bookkeeper and her gunman husband stand in the way of prosperity for your children? I am offering this valley the world." It was a brilliant move. He was bribing the entire town. The anger in the room faltered, replaced by the calculating look of men weighing their morals against their wallets. Prosperity. A voice, thin and reedy, cut through the silence from the back. "He talks a big game about prosperity." The crowd turned. Tobin Vale, the gambler, pushed his way forward, his face pale and sweating. He looked terrified, but he was furious. You believe him?" Vale yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Crow. "You think he'll share this prosperity? This man, Mr. Vale." "You're out of order," Crow's lawyer shouted. "He owes me," Vale shrieked, his voice cracking. "He promised me $100. $100 cash for services rendered for that business with Coyote Jack Durney. He promised me, and then he said I wasn't discreet enough. He stiffed me. He don't pay his debts." The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He had just publicly admitted to hiring the night raiders. He had just linked Crow directly to the raid, to the kidnapping, to the attempted arson. Crow's face went from purple to gray. The town looked from Vale to Crow. This wasn't about progress. It was about crime. Sheriff Holliday stood up, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Silas Crow. You are—" He never finished the sentence. A sound, low and distant, interrupted him. A rumble, like 1,000 freight wagons rolling over a wooden bridge. The windows of Granite Hall rattled. A man by the door, his face pale, looked outside. "Sheriff," he whispered. The rumble grew to a roar, and with it, a new sound, a terrible, cracking, splitting sound. The front doors of the hall burst open, and a ranch hand, soaked to the skin, stumbled in. "Flood," he screamed, pointing toward the hills. "It's Box Canyon. The whole thing's come undone. It's a flash flood. And it's heading for the levee." Panic. The hearing was forgotten. The levee, a massive earthen dam, was the only thing that held back the seasonal floods. It was also the only thing protecting the main town reservoir and the diversion gate for the Painted Arrow water tank. If the levee broke, the town would be submerged in 10 minutes. The Painted Arrow would be scoured from the earth. Crow's fraud didn't matter. The sky was about to execute them all. Rowan Cade moved. He didn't yell. He commanded. "Sandbags at the depot, every man move now." The room emptied in a stampede. The men, their moral confusion erased by pure terror, followed the one man who sounded like he had a plan. Crow was left standing alone, his lawyer already gone. Eliza ran out into a world gone mad. The sky was black. Rain wasn't falling. It was being thrown, hurled horizontally by a wind that screamed, and the sound a constant, deep-throated roar that vibrated in her bones. The women were standing, frozen, clutching their children, screaming. Eliza grabbed Sylvie March. "We can't just stand here. We need a line. The men can't fill and carry. We have to pass the bags." Sylvie's face was white, but she nodded, her eyes hard. She grabbed a panicked woman. "Martha, get the boys. We form a line from the sand pile to the levee now. Move." Sylvie became her lieutenant. In 2 minutes, Eliza had organized a second army. The women, the old men, the young boys, they formed a human chain, filling sacks with mud and sand, passing them, hand to hand, to the men working frantically on the levee. Eliza worked in the line, her hands raw, her back screaming. The mud was ankle-deep, then knee-deep. The roar of the water was deafening. She saw Rowan. He was on the levee itself, a giant in the storm, directing the men, plugging a break, his body a solid wall against the chaos. The levee was weeping. Water was pouring through a dozen small holes. "It's not enough," a man yelled. "The secondary berm, it's going a smaller. Secondary levee, the one that protected the main water tank's diversion gate, was groaning. The water was pouring over the top." Rowan grabbed 2 men. "We have to shore it or we lose the tank." He ran, grabbing a heavy, half-filled sandbag, and plunged through the waist-deep water to the berm. He got on top, the water swirling around his legs, and tried to plug the widening gap. The ground beneath him, saturated and slick, gave a sickening, sucking sound. He slipped. Eliza saw it. One moment he was there, a solid shape against the gray, churning water. The next, he was gone, sliding down the slick, muddy embankment, plunging into the main current. Rowan. He surfaced, 20 feet downstream, his head bobbing. He was a strong swimmer, but the water was full of debris, fence posts, branches, a dead cow. He grabbed for a handhold and found nothing. He was being swept away. Eliza didn't think. She didn't scream. She acted. She ran from the line, grabbing a heavy coil of hemp rope from the back of a supply wagon. Her fingers, numb and bleeding, fumbled with the end. The knot, the one that holds. The rabbit comes out of the hole. Her mind went cold and clear. She tied a perfect bowline, a loop around her own waist. She threw the other end of the rope to Sylvie. "Hold it, wrap it on that post. Hold it." She didn't wait for an answer. She plunged into the freezing, muddy water. It was like running into a moving wall. She got to the edge of the bank where he had fallen. "Rowan," she screamed, her voice tearing. She got on her belly, crawling through the sucking, treacherous mud, the rope paying out behind her. She was at the very edge. The bank was collapsing. He was 10 feet away, his arm hooked around a submerged fence post, but he was losing his grip. "Eliza, no, get back, it's too soft, go back, take my hand," she shrieked, stretching as far as she could, her other hand digging into the mud. "Take it!" He lunged, his fingers stretching. Their hands, both caked in thick, black mud, met. He grasped her wrist. She grasped his. At that exact second, a bolt of lightning, sharp and purple-white, tore the sky in half. It lit the entire valley with a cold, brilliant, instantaneous light, and every person in the town paused in their terror, saw it. They saw Eliza Hartwell, the small woman from the east, tied by a rope, lying flat in the mud, her arm outstretched, her hand locked with Rowan Cade's, holding him, saving him from the flood. It was an image burned onto their minds, a woman saving the man who was saving them. He roared. She screamed. And together, with Sylvie and 2 other women hauling on the rope, they pulled him, scrambling. From the water, he collapsed on the bank, coughing, dragging Eliza with him. The spell was broken. "It's holding," a man yelled. "The water it's holding." The crest had passed. The rain, as if a switch had been thrown, softened. The roar lessened. The levee had held. Slowly. The town bell began to ring. Not an alarm, in victory. Sheriff Holliday, soaked and muddy, climbed onto the wagon. "It's over, we held it, the water is secure." A ragged, exhausted cheer went up. Holliday let it die. He looked across the muddy field at Silas Crow, who stood alone by the depot, his fine suit in ruins. "And this hearing is over," Holliday bellowed, his voice carrying, "I've seen all the evidence I need, the paper, and the man, the forged documents are void. The water rights of the Painted Arrow Ranch are legal. Now and in perpetuity." Crow didn't move. He didn't speak. He just smiled, a thin, terrible, broken smile. In the chaos of the celebration, he turned, and with a quiet, deliberate pace, he walked away. Only one person saw him go. Maeve Alton. She saw him walk, not to his office, but to the feed store's attached hay barn, the one place that was still dry. She saw him step inside. "Oh, no you don't, you snake," she muttered. She didn't yell for the sheriff. She walked, stiff-legged, to the large manual water pump in the middle of the street. Crow emerged from the barn, a lit match in his hand. His face was a mask of insane, nihilistic rage. If he couldn't have the valley, he would burn it. He tossed the match toward the open bale of hay. "Not today," Maeve shrieked. She threw her weight onto the long iron handle of the pump. Clank, squoosh! A powerful muddy gout of water shot from the nozzle, hitting Crow square in the chest. It soaked him, knocked him backward, and extinguished the match in a cloud of steam. He slipped in the mud, stunned. Before he could get up, the 70-year-old woman was on him, her bony knee in his chest, her hands yanking his arms behind his back. She pulled a set of iron cuffs from her belt, the ones the sheriff had used on Durney. Click, click. Maeve Alton sat on Silas Crow's chest, breathing hard. "You are a disgrace to criminals. Silas, you couldn't even burn a barn right." The storm was over. The sky was turning a pale, washed-out gray. As the sun began to rise, it hit the receding water, turning the valley into a muddy, glittering mirror. Eliza and Rowan sat on the levee, their backs against a wet sandbag. They were indistinguishable, caked head to toe in the same black mud. They were exhausted. Every muscle ached. They were breathing in unison. He turned his head, his muddy face just inches from hers. She looked at him. The scar on his cheek was invisible, hidden by the mud. A small, hysterical giggle escaped her. It was a sound of pure, shattered relief. He looked at her, and a short, rough laugh barked out of his chest. They sat there, on the levee, at dawn, surrounded by the ruin of the flood, and they laughed. They laughed until they couldn't breathe, like 2 children who had just been born. The laughter died, settling into a shared, breathless quiet. Eliza, her body still trembling, lifted her hand. It was caked in mud, the nails broken, the knuckles raw. She laid it flat on his chest, on the solid, strong wall of him. Under her palm, she felt it, thump, 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 Strong, steady, alive. He looked down at her hand, lying there on his shirt. Then he slowly bent his head. He didn't kiss her. He lifted her hand, his own muddy fingers gentle beneath hers. He turned it over, and he pressed his lips to her muddy, torn, calloused palm. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a ritual. It was a vow. It was an oath of allegiance, more binding than any word spoken in a church, more final than any signature on a piece of paper. He had, in that single, silent gesture, given her his life. The night was deep and silent, washed clean by the storm. The stars, which had been hidden for so long, now blazed in the cold. Clear air, scattered like a handful of diamonds across the black velvet roof of the sky. The wind, when it moved, was no longer a threat. It was a soft breath, carrying the clean, sharp scent of wet earth, crushed sage, and soaked pine. They had worked until their muscles screamed, clearing the mud and debris from the house, reinforcing the washed-out sections of the corral. They had eaten cold beans and cornbread in a weary, shared silence, too tired for words. And now, the work was done, but they didn't go to their separate rooms. The house felt wrong. Somehow, too full of broken glass and splintered wood. By unspoken agreement, they found themselves in the barn. It was their fortress. It was what had been threatened. It was what they had held. They climbed the ladder to the hayloft, not for any practical reason, but because it was high and dry and safe. A pile of clean hay, saved from the worst of the water, was in the corner. Rowan lit a single lantern. The wick turned low and set it on a beam, where it cast a small, golden, trembling circle of light. They sat near the great, open loft door, their legs dangling, looking out at the vast, starry expanse of the Painted Arrow. The ranch, their ranch, lay sleeping and secure below them. For a long time, they just sat, breathing in the smell of the cured grass. Rowan had the small, dark block of ironwood in his hand. He wasn't whittling, not anymore. He was sanding, his thumb rubbing the wood in a slow, hypnotic circle. "I started this," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the immensity of the night. "The day I got the letter from the agency. The day I knew you were coming." He held it out. It was the ring, finished. It was simple, dark and polished to a deep, soft luster. The grain of the hard wood looking like a captured landscape. I used to I'd work on it when I was worried, which, I reckon, was most of the time. He gave a short, rough laugh. I was worried about the water, about Crow, about the ranch. He paused, his thumb still rubbing the ring. "But mostly I was worried about you, that you'd get here, and see this place see me, and that I wouldn't be enough." He looked at his own scarred, calloused hands. "I kept thinking, what right does a man like me have to ask for someone good? I never dared, I never thought I'd get to give it. I was afraid I wasn't. I wasn't good enough for the paper I signed. He didn't offer her the ring. He just held it, a confession, in his open palm." Eliza looked at the ring, gleaming in the lantern light. She thought of the man who had left her coffee, the man who had stood between her and the smoke, the man who had kissed her muddy palm. "Rowan," she said, her voice soft, but clear as the stars. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a vulnerability she had never seen. "I didn't come here looking for a good man," she said, her honesty a blade, cutting them both free. "I didn't come here looking for anything but an escape. I came here because I was running, because I was terrified, because I had nothing and nowhere else to go." She met his gaze, holding it steady. "I came because I had to, because I was fleeing." She reached out, and her fingers, still raw from the flood, closed over his hand, over the ring. "I am staying because you let me choose." The words hung in the air. It was the final lock, the last bolt sliding free. He looked at her hand covering his. A shudder went through his whole body, a release of tension he had held since the day she stepped off the stage. He turned his hand, his fingers lacing with hers, the small wooden ring warm between their palms. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, looked at... He leaned in, slowly. She met him halfway. Their foreheads touched. a familiar, solid gesture of equals. They stayed like that, just breathing, their eyes closed. "Eliza," he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. She lifted her head, just an inch. The kiss was not like the one in the line shack, born of rain and a shared secret. It was not the desperate, muddy oath on the levee. This was slow. This was a choice. His lips, chapped and warm, found hers. It was a question. She answered by not pulling away, by softening, by pressing back, just slightly. His free hand, the one that wasn't holding hers, came up. It didn't grab. It didn't pull. The pads of his rough fingers found the line of her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin just below her ear. He held her as if she were the most fragile, precious thing he had ever touched. She tasted coffee on his lips, and salt, and the clean, metallic taste of the night air. Her own hand, the one that wasn't holding his, came up and rested on his chest. She felt the heavy, solid thump, thump, thump of his heart hammering against her palm. He deepened the kiss, and it was like the flood, a slow, warm, inevitable wave that washed away every last remaining piece of fear, of doubt. It was a kiss that spoke of every silent dinner, every shared look over a fence line, every moment of terror, and every quiet victory. It was a kiss that said, "You are home. You are safe. You are mine." He drew back, his breath coming in ragged, unsteady gasps. He pressed his forehead to hers again. His eyes closed. "Rowan," she whispered. "I'm here." He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes, in the lantern light, were dark, full of a fierce, burning tenderness. He lifted his hand from her jaw, and with a single, gentle finger, he touched one of the steel pins that held her hair in its tight, severe bun. He didn't pull it. He just looked at her, asking. Eliza held his gaze. This was the last piece of armor. Slowly, she lifted her own hands. They were steady. She reached up, her fingers finding the pins. One by one. She pulled them free. The sound of them. A small metallic tink, tink, tink as they dropped onto the hay. Was the only sound in the barn. And with the last pin, her hair, heavy and dark, and smelling of the rain, fell. It tumbled over her shoulders, down her back. A soft, heavy wave that broke her eastern, rigid silhouette. A sound, almost a groan, escaped his chest. He lifted his hands, not to her body, but to her hair, his fingers sinking into the soft, thick mass of it, as if he couldn't believe it was real. "God, Eliza," he whispered. He held her face between his two hands, his thumbs at her temples, just looking at him. His gaze moved over her face, her eyes, her nose, her mouth, as if he was committing every line to memory, as if he was seeing her for the very first time. The night air was cool, and she shivered, the dampness from her clothes seeping in. He didn't hesitate. He reached behind him and grabbed the thick, heavy wool blanket that was folded there for just such a night. With one smooth, practiced motion, he unfurled it. He wrapped it around her, pulling her close, and then wrapped it around himself, cocooning them together in a private, warm, dark world. Inside the blanket, there was only warmth and the smell of clean wool and hay. He held her, his arms strong around her, her head tucked into the hollow of his shoulder. She could feel the heat of his body, a solid, living furnace, seeping through the thin cotton of their shirts. She could feel his heart, steady now, beating against her ear. They didn't speak. There was no need. They just held each other, a quiet, breathing knot of two souls. The crickets outside began their nightly song, a rhythmic, peaceful chirp, chirp, chirp that blended with the sound of their breathing. Here, in the dark, wrapped in wool, there was no past, no fire, no smoke, no fear. There was only this, safe, tender, and burning with a quiet, steady flame that warmed them from the inside out. Outside the loft door, unseen, the ancient cottonwood tree, its leaves washed clean, released its seeds. The small, white tufts of cotton floated on the night air, drifting past the barn, silent as snow, a summer snow, blessing a valley that had finally found its heart. Eldada, they lay back, pulling the blanket over them, her head resting in the crook of his arm. She was pressed against his side, a long, warm, solid line of safety. She smiled in the dark, her lips brushing the fabric of his shirt. "Rowan, that first day," she whispered, "when you said you didn't bite, unless she felt the laugh rumble in his chest before she heard it." "Yeah, well," she said, tilting her head back to look up at his shadowed face. "If this is thin less, I think I'd like some more." He gave a short, rough, wonderful laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He tightened his arm, rolling slightly, leaning over her. He kissed her forehead, her nose, her cheek. "Darlin," he whispered, his voice thick, his own lips smiling against her skin. He settled his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the dark. "I only do what you want." They slept. It was not a restless sleep. It was a deep, healing, absolute trust. She slept, for the first time in her memory, without a locked door, and for the first time in years. She dreamed, and there was no smoke. The dawn came in shades of rose and pale, clear blue. The air was cold and sharp. They woke slowly, tangled in the blanket, their limbs heavy, their minds clear. There was no awkwardness, no shame. He smiled at her, his eyes still soft with sleep, and kissed her, a slow, warm, morning kiss that tasted of a new beginning. They walked out of the barn, hand in hand, into the clean, bright morning. The ranch was battered, but it was whole. They went to the horse trough, the one she had used to fight the fire. The water was clear and cold, fed by the spring. He cupped his hands, catching the water, and held them out to her. She drank. Then she did the same for him. They washed their faces, side by side, the icy water a sharp, welcome shock. Eliza cupped her hands one last time, catching the water from the willow draw, the water she had fought for, the water she had saved, the water that was theirs. She drank it down. It was cold and clear and tasted as sweet as a promise. The trial of Silas Crow was a formality. It was not a trial by jury, but a territorial hearing, and the evidence was a mountain. Maeve Alton's pigskin ledger, with its unbroken wax seals, was presented as irrefutable. Sylvie March's father's private letters, detailing the $50 bribe attempt, were read aloud, causing a wave of hisses in the packed hall. Tobin Vale, granted immunity for his testimony, gleefully recounted every detail of Crow's plan, from the hiring of the Coyote Jack gang to the specific promise of payment for services rendered, which included the theft, the intimidation, and the kidnapping. The misspelled draft, found in Crow's own desk, was the final nail. Silas Crow sat alone, his expensive lawyer having quietly departed on the morning stage. He was a hollowed-out man, his power built on whispers and gold, evaporated by a flood and a few pieces of paper. He was found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted arson, and complicity in kidnapping. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, as Sheriff Holliday led him away in cuffs. The town of Sagebrush Vale was silent. They did not cheer. They simply watched the past being removed. Jack Durney and his men, captured in Box Canyon, were banished from Copper Mesa County forever, with the threat of being shot on sight if they ever returned. The following week, the men from the Mesquite Spur Railroad arrived, their faces grim, expecting their venture to be dead. Instead, they were met by a new Copper Mesa Council, with Sheriff Holliday at its head, and Maeve Alton, who had been recalled from retirement by popular demand. At his side, a new proposal was on the table. The council, not a private citizen, would build a new, larger communal reservoir, fed by the overflow from the Willow Draw. The railroad would get its water at a fair taxed price, which would in turn fund the town's first school and a proper doctor's office. The railroad men, practical and impressed, agreed on the spot. But who will supervise it, the foreman asked. Looking at the council, this is a complex matter. It needs a fair hand, and someone who understands the flow and the contracts. Sheriff Holliday looked at Sylvie, who looked at Maeve. They all smiled. "We have just the people," Holliday said. The charter for the Copper Mesa Water Compact will be supervised by 2 of our citizens, Mr. Rowan Cade and Mrs. Eliza Cade. The name, spoken aloud in an official capacity, sent a jolt through Eliza. Mrs. Eliza Cade. It was the first time she had heard it. It was no longer a name on a piece of paper. It was a title, a responsibility. It was a name written in real, permanent ink to wash away the mud and the memory of the trial. The town declared a celebration. It was held on the high meadow, right by the banks of the Willow Draw. The very ground they had fought for became their banquet hall. Tables were made of planks laid over barrels, groaning with food. Venison, roasted corn, pies, and barrels of beer and cider. A fiddler had been brought in from the next county, and his music was a bright, joyful thread in the warm afternoon air. Eliza stood by the stream, watching. She saw Sheriff Holliday, his face red, laughing as he helped a child fill a plate. She saw men who had once stared at her with suspicion now raise their cups to her as they passed. She was no longer an outsider. She was the woman who had saved the levee. She was the woman who had faced down Crow. Sylvie March came up beside her, her hands behind her back. "You look 1,000 miles away." Eliza admitted. "I was thinking of a train station, and how quiet it was, and how loud this is. This is what home sounds like," Sylvie said, her voice soft. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small sprig of wild sage, its leaves a silvery green, its scent sharp and clean. "For you," Sylvie said, "to cleanse the past, and to welcome you." She tucked the sprig into the ribbon of Eliza's bonnet. "Welcome home, Eliza." Eliza's eyes stung. She touched the soft leaves, and for the first time, she believed it. She was home. Rowan had been watching her from across the meadow. He saw the exchange. He saw the look on Eliza's face, the last lingering shadow of the refugee finally lifting. He knew it was time. He walked over, his boots silent in the grass. He didn't interrupt. He just waited until she turned and saw him. He held out his hand. "Walk with me." She placed her hand in his, and they left the noise of the party, walking a few yards down the bank to where the stream was quiet, gurgling over the rocks. He stopped, turning to face her. The sun was beginning to dip, and the light was the color of warm honey. He still held her hand. From his pocket, he took the ironwood ring. He didn't kneel. To kneel would have been wrong. It would have implied a plea, a begging, an unevenness. But after the flood, after the fight, they were, in all things, equals. He stood before her, eye to eye, their hands joined. He held the simple, dark wooden ring in his open palm. "Eliza Hartwell," he said, his voice low and steady, but she could feel the tremor in the hand that held hers. "You came here on a contract. You were bound to me by a piece of paper you signed when you were 1,000 miles away. And scared." He shook his head, his gaze intense. "You don't owe me anything. Not for this land, not for this house, not for my name. The flood washed away all the old debts. The fire burned the last of the contracts." He held up the ring. This is not paper. This is not a debt. This is just wood. From this land, shaped by my hand. And it's a choice." He looked into her eyes, his own gray ones clear and open. "If you choose this, if you choose me, I need you to choose it because you want to, because you are free, because this is the place you want to plant your feet. You owe me nothing. Eliza, choose, only if you want to choose." She looked at his face. The scar, which had once been a symbol of fear, was now just a part of him, a line that spoke of survival. She looked at the ring, simple and strong. She thought of her past, a life of running, of being a ghost. And she looked at him, her anchor, her partner, the man who had shown her what it meant to stand. She lifted her other hand and placed it over his, covering the ring. "I choose," she whispered. A breath he had been holding for months escaped him. His face, so often a mask of stone, broke into a smile of pure, dazzling relief. He took the ring. He lifted her left hand, the one that had been cut by glass, the one that had held his in the flood, and with a slow, deliberate and trembling motion. He slid the dark, smooth ironwood ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. A roar went up from the meadow. The town had been watching. They had seen. The fiddle struck a wild, joyful, thumping tune. The crowd surged toward them, clapping Rowan on the back, hugging Eliza, and the dancing began. Eliza, laughing, saw the most wonderful and absurd sight of her life. Sheriff Holliday, his face a bright, painful red, marching up to Maeve Alton. He bowed stiffly. "Ma'am," he stammered. "Would you that is do me the honor?" Maeve looked at him, then at his feet, then back at his face. She snorted. "Oh, why not? But you step on my foot. Holliday. And I'll have you in cuffs for obstruction." He grinned, and awkwardly, like two great shuffling bears, the sheriff and the notary began to dance. The entire town howled with laughter. The crowd parted, and Rowan took Eliza's hand. The fiddler saw them, and the music, just for a moment, slowed, softening into a simple, beautiful waltz. Rowan put his hand on the small of her back, just as he had in the line shack. But this was not a secret, furtive touch. This was public. It was a claim. It was proud. She put her hand on his strong shoulder. They began to move. They were not graceful dancers. They were too tired, too grounded in the earth. But they moved together. A simple, slow circle. He was the anchor, and she was the grace. In the middle of their valley, surrounded by their people, they danced. He leaned his head down, and she tilted hers up. Their foreheads touched. They closed their eyes, just for a beat, dancing not to the music, but to the steady, shared rhythm of their own hearts. Every eye was on them, and they were the only two people in the world. The wind moved through the ancient cottonwood tree at the edge of the meadow. It was not the howl of a storm. It was a soft, contented sigh. The valley was at peace, its heart steady. Later that night, the house was quiet. The new glass in Eliza's window reflected the light of the single lamp she had lit on the kitchen table. She sat, not in her room, but at the main table. She opened her purple-bound ledger. She dipped her pen. She turned to a new, clean page. She wrote the date, and then she wrote one final entry. September 2nd, 1886. Today. I am no longer mail order. I am a woman who was invited to stay. She closed the book. She would not need it again. Her accounts were, for the first time in her life, perfectly balanced. She heard his boots on the porch. He had been doing a final check on the new fence line, the one they had built together. He didn't come in, just leaned against the doorframe, watching her. She looked up and smiled. "Walk with me," he asked. She took her shawl and joined him. They stood on the porch, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep gold and violet. The air was cool, smelling of the dry grass. They stood side by side, their shoulders brushing. He turned, and she saw he was smiling. That slow, half-smile, the one she had seen on her first day. But it was no longer a grimace. It was no longer a joke. It was warm, and it was real, and it was just for her. He leaned in, his voice that low, familiar rumble that felt more like home than any building. "Darlin." She knew what was coming. She smiled up at him, her heart so full it ached. "I don't bite." He paused, his eyes twinkling, unless Eliza lifted her hand, the one with the new, dark ring. She laid her fingers against the scar on his cheek, a line she now knew by heart. "You ask first," she whispered, and I nod. He laughed, a low, happy sound, and pulled her close, kissing her deeply as the first stars began to appear. The camera pulled back, showing two small figures, silhouetted against the vast, golden prairie, their shadows merging into one. They turned and walked back into the house, their house, from the barn. The sound of horses, ash and quiver, nickering softly, a sound of peace, a sound of freedom, worn not like a brand, but like a vow. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be so honored if you'd let us know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. And share your thoughts. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support the channel, please hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more folks. We appreciate every one of you.